They were handing down sentences right and left. And we know, too, that every time a city was captured during the Civil War, the event was marked not only by gun smoke in the courtyards of the Cheka, but also by sleepless sessions of the tribunal. And you did not have to be a white officer, a senator, a landowner, a monk, a cadet, an SR, or an anarchist in order to get your bullet. Soft, white, uncalloused hands alone were sufficient in those years. But one can also hazard the guess that in Izhevsk or Votkinsk, Yaroslavl or Murom, Kozlov or Tambov, the uprisings were very costly as well to those who had calloused workers' hands. And if those scrolls of both the extrajudicial executions and those by tribunal are unrolled for us some day, the most surprising thing will be the number of ordinary peasants we find on them, because there was no end to the number of peasant uprisings and revolts from 1918 to 1921, even though they did not adorn the colored pages of the official history of the Civil War, and even though no one photographed them, and no one filmed motion pictures of those furious crowds attacking machine guns with clubs, pitchforks, and axes, and later lined up for execution with their arms tied behind their backs. 10 for 1. The revolt in Zappos is remembered only in Zappos, the one in Petalino only in Petalino. We learn from Latsis the number of peasant rebellions that were suppressed during that same year and a half in 20 provinces, 344. From 1918 on, peasant revolts were already being called kulak revolts, for how could the peasants revolt against the workers' and peasants' power? But how then could one explain that in every instance it was not just 3 peasant huts that revolted, but the whole village? Why did the masses of poor peasants not kill the insurgent kulaks with those same pitchforks and axes, instead of marching with them against the machine guns? Latsis claims, the kulaks compelled the rest of the peasants to take part in these revolts by promises, slander, and threats. But what could have been more laden with promises than the slogans of the committees of the poor, and what could have been more loaded with threats than the machine guns of the special purpose detachments, the CHON? And how many wholly random people, completely random, whose destruction inevitably accounts for half the casualties of every real shooting revolution, were caught between those millstones? Here is an eyewitness description of a session of the Ryazan Rev Tribunal, which met in 1919 to hear the case of the Tolstoyan IYE-V. With the proclamation of universal and compulsory conscription into the Red Army, just 1 year after the slogans, "Down with the war," "Stick your bayonets in the ground," "Go home," 54,697 deserters were caught and sent to the front by September 1919 in Ryazan province alone. And how many others were shot on the spot as examples? YE-V was not a deserter at all, but a man who simply and openly refused to enter military service because of his religious convictions. He was conscripted by main force, but in the barracks he refused to take up arms or undergo training. The enraged political commissar of the unit turned him over to the Cheka, saying, "He does not recognize the Soviet government." There was an interrogation. 3 Chekists sat behind the desk, each with a Naguan revolver in front of him. "We have seen heroes like you before. You'll be on your knees to us in a minute. Either agree to fight immediately or we'll shoot you." But YE-V was firm. He couldn't fight. He was a believer in free Christianity. And his case was sent to the Rev Tribunal. It was an open session with 100 spectators in the hall. There was a polite elderly defense lawyer. The learned accuser, the term prosecutor was forbidden until 1922, was Nikolsky, another old jurist. One of the members of the Rev Tribunal, a juror, tried to elicit the views of the accused. How can you, a representative of the working people, share the opinions of the aristocrat Count Tolstoy? But the presiding judge interrupted the questioning and refused to permit it to continue. There was a quarrel. Juror: "You do not want to kill people, and you try to persuade others to refrain from killing. But the whites began the war, and you are preventing us from defending ourselves. We will send you to Kolchak, and you can preach your non-resistance there." YE-V: "I will go wherever you send me." Accuser: This tribunal is not supposed to concern itself with any nondescript criminal actions, but only with those which are counter-revolutionary. In view of the nature of this crime, I demand that the case be turned over to a people's court. Presiding Judge. Ha! Actions! What a pettifogger you are! We are guided not by the laws, but by our revolutionary conscience. Accuser. I insist that you include my demand in the record. Defense Attorney. I support the accuser. The case should be heard in an ordinary court. Presiding Judge. There's an old fool for you. Where did they manage to find him? Defense Attorney. I have been a practicing lawyer for 40 years, and this is the first time I have heard such an insult. Enter it in the record. Presiding Judge, laughing. We'll enter it. We'll enter it. Laughter in the hall. The court exits in order to confer. The sounds of a noisy argument come from the conference room. They return with the sentence. To be shot. Loud indignation in the hall. Accuser. I protest against the sentence and will complain to the Commissariat of Justice. Defense Lawyer. I join my voice to that of the accuser. Presiding Judge. Clear the hall. The convoy came and led Y.E.V. to jail, saying to him, If everyone was like you, brother, how good it would be. There would be no war, and no whites and no reds. They went back to their barracks and called a Red Army meeting. It condemned the sentence and sent a protest to Moscow. In daily expectation of death, Y.E.V. waited for 37 days, while, from the prison window, he watched executions taking place. They commuted his sentence to 15 years of strict detention. This is an instructive example. Although revolutionary legality won a partial victory, how enormous an effort it required on the part of the presiding judge, how much disorganization, lack of discipline, lack of political consciousness there still was. The prosecution stood firmly with the defense. The convoy guards stuck their noses into something that wasn't their business in order to send off a protest. Phew! The dictatorship of the proletariat and the new kind of court were not having things easy by any means. Of course, not all the sessions were anything like so turbulent, but this wasn't the only one of its kind. How many years it would take to reveal, direct, and confirm the necessary line until the defense would stand as one with the prosecution and the court, and the accused would be in agreement with them too, and all the resolutions of the workers as well. To pursue this enterprise of many years' duration is the rewarding task of the historian. As for us, how are we to make our way through that rosy mist? Whom are we to ask about it? Those who are shot aren't talking, and neither are those who have been scattered to the four winds. Even if the defendants, and the lawyers, and the guards, and the spectators have survived, no one will allow us to seek them out. Evidently, the only help we will get is from the prosecution. In this connection, I was given by well-wishers an intact copy of a collection of speeches for the prosecution, delivered by that fierce revolutionary, the first People's Commissar of Military Affairs in the Workers' and Peasants' Government, the Commander-in-Chief, and later the organizer of the Department of Exceptional Courts of the People's Commissariat of Justice, where the personal rank of tribune was being readied for him, until Lenin vetoed the title. Lenin, 5th edition, volume 36, page 210. The glorious accuser in the greatest trials, subsequently exposed as the ferocious enemy of the people, N.V. Krylenko. Krylenko Zappos, 1918-1922, edition 7,000 copies, prosecution speeches in the most important trials held before the Moscow and the Supreme Revolutionary Tribunals. And if, despite everything, we want to attempt a brief review of the public trials, if we are determined to try to get a feeling for the judicial atmosphere of the first post-revolutionary years, then we have to learn to read this Krylenko text. We have no other. And using it as a basis, we must try to picture to ourselves everything that is missing from it, and everything that happened in the provinces too. Of course, we would prefer to see the stenographic record of those trials, to listen to the dramatic voices from beyond the grave of those first defendants and those first lawyers, speaking at a time when no one could have foreseen in what implacable sequence all of it would be swallowed up, together with those Rev Tribunal members as well. However, as Krylenko has explained, for a whole series of technical reasons, it was inconvenient to publish the stenographic records. It was convenient only to publish his speeches for the prosecution and the sentences handed down by the tribunals, which by that time had already come to jibe completely with the demands of the accuser-prosecutor. Krylenko claims that the archives of the Moscow Rev Tribunal and the Supreme Rev Tribunal turned out, by 1922, to be far from orderly. In a whole series of cases, the stenographic records were so incomprehensible that it was necessary either to cross out entire pages or else to try to restore the text from memory. And a series of the biggest trials, including the trial which followed the revolt of the left SRs and the case of Admiral Shashastny, were conducted entirely without stenographic records. This is strange. The condemnation of the left SRs was not a trivial matter. It was, after the February and October revolutions, the third turning point in our history, signaling the transition to a one-party system in the state. Not a few of them were shot, and no stenographic record was made. And the military plot of 1919 was liquidated by the Cheka in an extrajudicial reprisal, which was further proof of its existence. In this case, more than 1,000 people were arrested altogether, and really, how could trials have been set up for them all? So just try to produce a neat, orderly report on the trials of those years. Nevertheless, we can learn the important principles involved in them. For example, the Supreme Accuser, in other words, the Prosecutor General, informs us that the All-Russian Central Executive Committee had the right to intervene in any judicial proceeding. VTSIK pardons and punishes at its own discretion without any limitation whatever. For example, a 6-month sentence was changed to 10 years, and as the reader understands, it was not necessary for the entire All-Russian Central Executive Committee to assemble at a plenary meeting to this end, since its chairman, Sverdlov, for example, could correct a sentence without leaving his office. All of this, Krylenko explains, shows the superiority of our system over the false theory of the separation of powers, that is, the theory of the independence of the judiciary. True, Sverdlov also said, "It is very good that the legislative and executive power are not divided by a thick wall as they are in the West. All problems can be decided quickly, especially on the phone." Krylenko formulated even more frankly and precisely the general tasks of the Soviet courts in his speeches before those tribunals, when the court was, at one and the same time, both the creator of the law, Krylenko's italics, and a political weapon, my italics. Creator of the law because for 4 years there were no codes. They had thrown out the Tsarist codes, and they had not composed their own. Don't tell me our criminal courts ought to act exclusively on the basis of existing written norms. We live in the process of revolution. A tribunal is not the kind of court in which fine points of jurisprudence and clever stratagems are to be restored. We are creating a new law and new ethical norms. And also, no matter how much is said here about the eternal law of truth, justice, etc., we know how dearly these have cost us. But if your prison terms are compared with ours, maybe it didn't cost you so dearly after all. Maybe eternal justice was somewhat more comfortable. The reason that fine points of jurisprudence are unnecessary is that there is no need to clarify whether the defendant is guilty or not guilty. The concept of guilt is an old bourgeois concept which has now been uprooted. And so we have heard from Comrade Krylenko that a tribunal was not that kind of court. On another occasion we would hear from him that a tribunal was not a court at all. A tribunal is an organ of the class struggle of the workers directed against their enemies, and must act from the point of view of the interests of the revolution, having in mind the most desirable results for the masses of workers and peasants. People are not people, but carriers of specific ideas. No matter what the individual qualities of the defendant, only one method of evaluating him is to be applied, evaluation from the point of view of class expediency. In other words, you can exist only if it's expedient for the working class, and if, this expediency should require that the avenging sword should fall on the head of the defendants, then no verbal arguments can help, such as arguments by lawyers, etc. In our revolutionary court we are guided not by articles of the law, and not by the degree of extenuating circumstances. In the tribunal we must proceed on the basis of considerations of expediency. That was the way it was in those years. People lived and breathed, and then suddenly found out that their existence was inexpedient. And it must also be kept in mind that it was not what he had done that constituted the defendant's burden, but what he might do if he were not shot now. We protect ourselves not only against the past, but also against the future. Comrade Krylenko's pronouncements are clear and all-inclusive. They bring alive for us that whole period of the law in sharp relief. The clarity of autumn suddenly pierces the mists of spring and reaches us. And is it perhaps unnecessary to go further? Perhaps we aren't required to page through trial after trial. These pronouncements will be henceforth inexorably applied. Close your eyes tight for a minute and picture a tiny courtroom, not yet gilded. Earnest members of the tribunal in simple field jackets, lean, not yet fat-faced. The accusing power, as Krylenko loved to style himself, wears an unbuttoned civilian jacket with a glimpse of a sailor's striped undershirt just visible at the open throat. The supreme accuser expresses himself in this sort of language. The question of fact is interesting to me. Define concretely the aspect of the tendency. We are operating on the plane of analysis of objective truth. Sometimes, as you read, a quotation from the Latin shines out. It is true that the same quotation turns up in case after case, but after several years a different one does appear. And no wonder. He did, after all, complete the course in 2 faculties, despite all his revolutionary running around. What attracts one to him are his frank opinions about the defendants. Professional scoundrels! And he isn't hypocritical in the least. If he didn't like the defendants' smile, he didn't hesitate to blurt out a threat, even before any sentence was imposed. And as for you and your smile, Citizeness Ivanova, we'll make you pay for it, and we'll find a way to fix it so that you never laugh again. So, shall we begin? A. The case of Russkiye Vedomosti. In this case, one of the earliest, free speech was on trial. On March the 24th, 1918, this famous professorial newspaper published an article by Savinkov entitled En route. They would have much preferred to arrest Savinkov himself, but he really was en route, damn it, and where was he to be found? So instead they closed down the paper and brought the elderly editor, P.V. Yegorov, to court as a defendant, insisting that he explain how he had dared to publish the article. After all, the new era was 4 months old, and it was time to get used to it. Yegorov naively defended himself by saying that the article had been written by a leading political figure whose opinion was of general interest, whether or not the editors shared it. Furthermore, he saw nothing slanderous in Savinkov's having said, "Let us not forget that Lenin, Natanson, and co. arrived in Russia via Berlin." That is, that the German authorities helped them return to the homeland. Because that, in actual fact, was what had happened. Kaiser Wilhelm's embattled Germany had helped Comrade Lenin to return. Krylenko retorted that he would not conduct a prosecution for slander. Why not? And that the newspaper was on trial for attempting to influence people's minds. And how could any newspaper dare have such a purpose? The formal charge did not include Savinkov's phrase, "One has to be criminally insane to affirm seriously that the international proletariat will come to our aid," because it still would come to our aid. For attempting to influence people's minds, the newspaper, which had been published since 1864 and had survived the most fiercely reactionary periods, those of Loris Melikov, Povedonetsov, Stolypin, Cassot, and all the rest, was ordered closed down forever. And Yegorov, the editor, and this is a shameful thing to have to say, was given only 3 months of solitary, just as though we were in Greece or some such place. It is not so shamefully lenient, however, if one stops to think that it was only 1918, and if the old man managed to survive, he would be imprisoned again, and many more times, too. It may seem strange to us now, but it is a fact that in those thunderous years bribes were given and taken just as tenderly as they had been from time immemorial in old Russia, and as they will be in the Soviet Union from here to eternity. Bribery was particularly rife in the judicial organs, and though we blush to say it, in the Cheka. The official histories, in their red, gold-stamped bindings, are silent about this, but the old folks and eyewitnesses remember that the fate of political prisoners in the first years of the Revolution, as distinct from Stalinist times, often depended on bribes. They were accepted uninhibitedly, and prisoners were honestly released as a result. Although Krylenko picked out only a dozen cases for the 5-year period his book covers, he reports 2 cases of bribery. Alas, even the Moscow Tribunal and the Supreme Tribunal squeezed their way through to perfection along a crooked path, muddied themselves in improprieties. B. The case of the 3 interrogators of the Moscow Rev Tribunal, April 1918. In March 1918, a speculator in gold bars named Berije was arrested. His wife tried to find a way to ransom her husband, which was the accepted thing to do. Through a series of connections, she succeeded in getting to one of the interrogators, who brought 2 others in with him. Meeting secretly, they demanded a bribe of 250,000 rubles, but after some bargaining, they reduced it to 60,000, half in advance. The deal was to be made through the lawyer Grin. Everything would have gone off without a fuss, as hundreds of similar deals had, and the case would have gotten into neither Krylenko's chronicle nor ours, nor even become a matter of concern to the Council of People's Commissars, had it not been that Beriji's wife began to get miserly and brought Green only 15,000 as an advance payment instead of 30,000. But the main thing was that, in consequence of female fickleness, she changed her mind overnight, decided her lawyer wasn't good enough for her, and went off the next morning to find another, the attorney Yakulov. It is not stated anywhere, but it was evidently Yakulov who decided to turn in the interrogators. It is of interest that all the witnesses in this trial, beginning with the unfortunate wife, tried to give testimony helpful to the accused and to befuddle the prosecution, which would have been impossible in a political trial. Krylenko explained their conduct as the result of a narrow-minded Philistine attitude, because they felt like outsiders as far as the Rev Tribunal was concerned. And might we ourselves be so audacious as to advance the Philistine hypothesis that in the course of a year and a half the witnesses had already learned to be afraid of the dictatorship of the proletariat? After all, it took a lot of nerve to turn in the interrogators of the Rev Tribunal. What would happen to you after that? The accuser's line of argument is also of interest. After all, just a month earlier, the defendants had been his associates, his comrades in arms, his assistants. They were people who had been inalienably dedicated to the interests of the revolution, and one of them, Leist, was even a stern accuser capable of hurling thunder and lightning at anyone who attacked the foundations. What was he to say about them now? Where was he to look for the causes of their fall? A bribe was not enough in itself. And, of course, it is clear where he looked, in their pasts, in their biographies. Declared Krylenko, "If we look closely at this Leist, we will find highly interesting information." This is intriguing. Was he an inveterate adventurer? No, but he was the son of a professor at Moscow University, and not an ordinary professor, but one who had survived 20 years of reaction by his indifference to political activity, and who, notwithstanding that reaction, had been accepted by Krylenko as a consultant. Was it surprising, then, that the son turned out to be a double dealer?
This book is continued on Cassette 2,
The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1, Section 2, continued.
Cassette 2, Side 1.
Was it surprising, then, that the son turned out to be a double dealer? As for Podgaisky, he was the son of an official in the law courts, beyond doubt one of the reactionary pogrom-organizing Black Hundreds. Otherwise, how could he have served the Tsar for 20 years? And the son, too, had prepared for a career in the law courts, but then the revolution had come, and he had wormed his way into the Rev Tribunal. Just yesterday all this had been depicted in a very favorable light, but it had suddenly become repulsive. More repulsive than them both was, of course, Gugal. He had been a publisher, and what intellectual food had he been offering the workers and peasants? He was nourishing the broad masses with low-quality literature, not Marx, but instead books by bourgeois professors with world-famous names. And we shall soon encounter these professors as defendants, too. Krylenko is enraged and marvels at the kind of people who have sneaked into the tribunal. Neither do we understand what kind of people are the workers' and peasants' tribunals composed of. Why had the proletariat entrusted the task of striking down their enemies to people of this particular kind? And as for Green, the lawyer, a man with an in on the investigating commission, who was quite able to get anybody off scot-free, he was a typical representative of that subspecies of the human race which Marx called leeches on the capitalist structure, a category including, in addition, all lawyers, gendarmes, priests, and also notaries. It appears that Krylenko spared no effort in demanding mercilessly severe sentences without reference to the individual shadings of guilt. But some kind of lethargy, some sort of torpor, overcame the eternally vigorous tribunal, and it just barely managed to mumble 6 months in jail for the interrogators and a fine for the lawyer. And only by availing himself of the authority of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee to punish without limitation did Krylenko, there in the metropole, continue to hang 10-year sentences on the interrogators and 5 on the lawyer, plus full confiscation of his property. Krylenko thundered on about vigilance, and he almost managed, but not quite, to get the title of tribune he so coveted. We recognize that among the revolutionary masses at the time, as among our readers today, this unfortunate trial could not but undermine faith in the sanctity of the tribunal, and we therefore proceed with even greater timidity to the next case, which concerned an even loftier institution. C. The case of Kozyrev, February the 15th, 1919. F.M. Kozyrev and his pals Libet, Rottenberg, and Solovyev had first served on the Commission for Supply of the Eastern Front, back before Kolchak, when the enemy forces were the armies of the Constituent Assembly. It was discovered that there they had found ways to siphon into their own pockets from 70,000 to 1,000,000 rubles at a time. They rode around on fine horses and engaged in orgies with the nurses. Their commission had acquired a house and an automobile, and their major domo lived it up in the Yar restaurant. We aren't accustomed to picturing 1918 in this light, but all this was in the testimony of the Rev Tribunal. But none of this, to be sure, was the case against them. No charge had been brought against any of them in connection with their activities on the Eastern Front. They had even been forgiven all that. But, wonder of wonders, hardly had their commission for supply been disbanded than all 4 of them, with the addition of Nazarenko, a former Siberian tramp and convict pal of Kozyrev in criminal hard labor, were invited to constitute the Control and Auditing Collegium of the VCHK, the Cheka. Here's what this collegium was. It had plenipotentiary powers to verify the legality of the actions of all the remaining organs of the Cheka, the right to demand and review any case at any stage of its processing, and to reverse the decisions of all the remaining organs of the VCHK, excepting only the Presidium of the Cheka. This was no small thing. This collegium was second in command in the Cheka after the Presidium itself. It ranked immediately below Dzerzhinsky, Uritsky, Peters, Latsis, Menzhinsky, Yogoda. The way of life of this comradely group remained just what it had been before. They didn't get swelled heads. They didn't get carried away. With certain individuals named Maximich, Lenka, Rafaelsky, and Mariupolsky, who had no connection at all with the Communist Party, they set up, in private apartments and in the Hotel Savoy, lavish establishments where card games with table stakes as high as 1,000 rubles a throw were the order of the day, along with heavy drinking and women. Kozyrev acquired a rich establishment of his own, costing 70,000 rubles, and in fact did not even draw the line at hauling off silver spoons and goblets and even ordinary glassware from the Cheka. And how did all these objects get to the Cheka? And this was where his attention was concentrated, rather than in the direction of ideas and ideology, and this was what he took from the revolutionary movement. In the very act of repudiating the bribes he had accepted, this leading Chekist, without blinking, volunteered the lie that he possessed 200,000 rubles from an inheritance in a Chicago bank. Evidently, as far as he was concerned, there was no conflict between such a circumstance and world revolution. Now, how did he propose to make proper use of his superhuman right to arrest anyone at all and release anyone at all? Clearly, one had to find a fish with golden roe, and in 1918 there were not a few such fish in the nets. After all, the revolution had been carried out too quickly. They hadn't found everything. How many precious stones, necklaces, bracelets, rings, and earrings the bourgeois ladies had managed to hide away. Then one had to make contact with the relatives of those who had been arrested through some reliable middleman. Such characters also passed before us at the trial. There was Uspenskaya, a woman of 22. She had graduated from the St. Petersburg Gymnasium, but hadn't gone on to the university. The Soviets had come to power. And so, in the spring of 1918, Uspenskaya appeared at the Cheka to offer her services as an informer. She qualified on the basis of her appearance, and they accepted her. Krylenko has this to say about informing, which in those days had a different label. For ourselves, we see nothing shameful in it. We consider this to be our duty. The work itself is not disgraceful. Once a person admits that this work is necessary in the interests of the revolution, then he must do it. But alas, it turned out that Uspenskaya had no political credo. That's what was awful. She declared, "I agreed in order to be paid a fixed percentage on the cases which were turned up, and beyond that, to split 50-50 with someone else, whom the court protected and instructed her not to identify." Krylenko put it in his own words. Uspenskaya was not a staff member of the Cheka, but worked at piece rates. And incidentally, the accuser, understanding her in a very human way, explains that she had grown used to having plenty of money, and that her insignificant salary of 500 rubles from the Supreme Council of the Economy was nothing at all, considering that one exercise in extortion, for example, helping a merchant get the seal removed from his store, would net her 5,000 rubles, and another, from Meshcherskaya Grev's, wife of a prisoner, would bring in 17,000. For that matter, Uspenskaya served only briefly as a mere stool pigeon. Thanks to the help of certain big Chekists, in a few months she became a member of the Communist Party and an interrogator. However, we don't seem to be getting to the essence of the case. Uspenskaya had arranged a meeting between this Meshcherskaya Grevs and a certain Godelyuk, a bosom pal of Kozyrev, in order to reach an agreement on her husband's ransom. They had initially demanded 600,000 rubles. But unfortunately, by some still unexplained means, the arrangements for that secret meeting became known to the same attorney, Yakulov, who had already done in the 3 bribe-taking interrogators, and who evidently felt a class hatred for the whole proletarian system of judicial and extrajudicial processing. Yakulov denounced them to the Moscow Rev Tribunal, and the presiding judge of the tribunal, recalling perhaps the wrath of the Council of People's Commissars in connection with the 3 interrogators, also blundered in terms of class premises. In order to temper the reader's indignation against this leech-like snake, Yakulov, we should point out that by the time of Kozyrev's trial, he had already been arrested and was in custody. They had found a case to take care of him. He was brought in to testify, accompanied by convoy, and we are certainly entitled to hope that he was shot soon afterward. Today we are surprised. How did things reach such a pitch of illegality? Why did no one mount an offensive against it? Instead of simply warning Comrade Dzerzhinsky and working it all out in the family, he hid a stenographer behind the curtain,
and the stenographer took down all Godelyuk's references to Kosyrev, and to Solovyev, and to other commissars, and all his stories about who in the checker takes how many thousands. Then, as per the stenographic record, Godelyuk received an advance payment of 12,000 rubles, and Meshcherskaya Grevs was given a pass to enter the checker that had already been filled out by the Control and Auditing Collegium, by Libert and Rottenberg. The bargaining was to continue there, inside the checker. Then and there Godelyuk was caught. In his confusion, he gave testimony against them. And Meshcherskaya Grevs had already gotten to the Control and Auditing Collegium, and they had already ordered her husband's case transferred there for verification. But just a moment. After all, an exposé like this sullies the heavenly blue uniforms of the checker. Was the presiding judge of the Moscow Rev Tribunal in his right mind? Was he really tending to his own business? But it turns out that that was the nature of the moment, a moment totally hidden from us in the folds of our majestic history. It seems that the checker's first year of work had produced a somewhat repellent impression even on the party of the proletariat, which still hadn't gotten used to it. Only its first year had passed. The checker had taken only the first step on its glorious path. And already, as Krylenko writes, although not very clearly, a dispute had arisen between the court and its functions and the extrajudicial functions of the checker, a dispute which at the time split the party and the workers' district into two camps. And that is how the Kosyrev case could come up, whereas everything had gone smoothly before, and reach all the way up to the topmost level of the whole state apparatus. The checker had to be saved. Help! Save the checker! Solovyev asked the tribunal to allow him inside the Taganka prison to visit Godelyuk, who alas was not in the Lubyanka, so as to chat with him. The tribunal declined the request. Then Solovyev managed to penetrate into Godelyuk's cell without the help of any tribunal, and, what a coincidence, at that very point Godelyuk became seriously ill. One can hardly speak of evil intentions on Solovyev's part, Krylenko bows and scrapes. Feeling the approach of death, Godelyuk shakily repented having slandered the checker and asked for a sheet of paper on which to write his recantation. It was all untrue. He had slandered Kosyrev and the other commissars of the checker, and everything the stenographer had taken down behind the curtain was also untrue. Oh, how many themes we have here. Oh, where is Shakespeare? Solovyev passes through the walls, flickering shadows in the cell. Godelyuk recants with failing hand, and all we hear about the years of the revolution in our plays and our films is the street singing of hostile whirlwinds. And who filled out the passes for Meshcherskaya Grevs? Krylenko insisted. They hadn't materialized out of thin air, certainly. No, the chief accuser does not wish to say that Solovyev was an accessory in this case because there is insufficient evidence. But he advances the hypothesis that citizens still at liberty who were in danger of being caught with their hands in the till might have sent Solovyev to the Taganka jail. This was the perfect time to question Libert and Rottenberg, and they were subpoenaed, but they didn't appear. Just like that. They didn't show up. They declined to. All right, in that case, question Meshcherskaya Grevs. And, can you imagine it? This broken-down aristocrat, too, was so brazen as not to appear before the Rev Tribunal. And there was no way to force her to. Godelyuk had recanted and was dying. Kosyrev refused to admit anything. Solovyev was not guilty of anything. So there was no one to question. What witnesses, on the other hand, did indeed appear before the tribunal, and of their own free will? The deputy chief of the checker, Comrade Peters, and even Felix Edmundovich Dzerzhinsky himself. He arrived in a state of alarm. His long, burning, zealot's face confronted the tribunal, whose members sat with sinking hearts, and he testified passionately in defense of the totally innocent Kosyrev and his high moral, revolutionary, and professional qualities. This testimony, alas, has not been preserved for us, but Krylenko refers to it this way. Solovyev and Dzerzhinsky portrayed Kosyrev's wonderful qualities. Alas, you careless shave-tail, you, in 20 years' time in the Lubyanka, they are going to remind you of that trial. It is easy to guess what Dzerzhinsky could have said, that Kozyrev was an iron Chekist, merciless to their enemies, that he was a good comrade, a hot heart, a cool head, clean hands. And from the garbage heap of slander, the bronze knight Kozyrev rises before our eyes. Furthermore, his whole biography testifies to his remarkable will. Before the revolution, he was convicted several times, most often for murder. In the city of Kostroma, he was convicted of worming his way by deception into the house of an old woman named Smirnova and strangling her with his own hands, then of an attempt to kill his own father, and then of killing a comrade in order to use his passport. The rest of Kozyrev's convictions were for swindling, and in all he spent many years at hard labor. One could understand his desire for a luxurious life. And he had only been freed by the Tsarist amnesties. At that point, the stern and righteous voices of the major Chekists interrupted the chief accuser. They pointed out to him that those courts which had convicted Kozyrev were courts of the bourgeoisie and landowners and did not merit being noticed in our new society. But what happened? The shave-tail, going overboard, poured forth from the chief accuser's rostrum a tirade so ideologically faulty that in our exposition of this harmonious series of cases tried by the tribunals, citing it is to strike a discordant note. If there was anything good in the old Tsarist court system, it was only trial by jury. One could always have confidence in the jurors' decisions, and a minimum of judicial error was to be found in them. It was all the more vexing to hear this sort of thing from Comrade Krylenko, because just 3 months before, at the trial of the provocateur R. Malinovsky, a former favorite of the Communist Party leadership, who, notwithstanding his 4 criminal convictions in the past, had been co-opted into the Central Committee by the leadership and appointed to the Duma, the accusing power had taken an impeccable class stand. Every crime is the result of a given social system, and in these terms criminal convictions under the laws of a capitalist society and in Tsarist times do not, in our eyes, constitute a fact branding a person with an indelible mark once and for all. We know of many examples of persons in our ranks branded by such facts in the past, but we have never drawn the conclusion that it was necessary to remove such a person from our milieu. A person who knows our principles cannot fear that the existence of previous criminal convictions in his record will jeopardize his being included in the ranks of the revolutionaries. That is how Comrade Krylenko could speak when in a party vein. But in this other case, as a result of his mistaken judgment, the image of the knight in shining armor, Kozyrev, was being bespattered. And it created a situation in the tribunal wherein Comrade Dzerzhinsky was forced to say, "For just 1 second, the thought crossed my mind that Citizen Kozyrev might be falling victim to the political passions which in recent times have blazed up around the Extraordinary Commission." And Krylenko suddenly took thought. "I do not wish, and I never have wished, that the present trial should turn into a trial of the Cheka rather than a trial of Kozyrev and Uspenskaya. Not only am I unable to desire such an outcome, I am obliged to fight against it with all available means." And he went on. "The most responsible, honest, and self-controlled comrades were put at the head of the Extraordinary Commission, and they took on themselves the difficult task of striking down the enemy, even though this involved the risk of error. For this the revolution is obliged to say thank you. I underline this aspect so that no one can ever say to me later, 'He turned out to be an instrument of political treason.' But that's what they will say." What a razor edge the supreme accuser was walking, but he evidently had certain contacts going back to his days in the underground, through which he learned how things were going to move on the morrow. This is conspicuous in several trials, and came out here too. At the beginning of 1919, there were certain trends toward saying, "It is enough, it is time to bridle the Cheka." And this moment was beautifully caught in Bukharin's essay, in which he said that revolutionary legality must give way to legalized revolutionality. Wherever you look, you see dialectics. And Krylenko burst out, "The Rev Tribunal is being called on to replace the Extraordinary Commission." To replace? Meanwhile, it must be no less fierce in implementing the system of terror, intimidation, and threat than was the Extraordinary Commission, the Cheka. Than it was? The past tense. Has he already buried it? Come now, you are going to replace it, and where are the Chekists supposed to go? Ominous days. That was reason enough to hurry to the tribunal in a greatcoat down to one's heels to testify as a witness. But perhaps your sources of information, Comrade Krylenko, are false. Yes, the heavens darkened over the Lubyanka in those days, and this whole book might have been very different. But I suppose that what happened was that Iron Felix Dzerzhinsky went to see Vladimir Ilyich Lenin and talked it over and explained, and the skies cleared. And although 2 days later, on February the 17th, 1919, the Cheka was deprived of its judicial rights by special decree of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee, it was not for long. Our day in court was further complicated by the fact that the objectionable Uspenskaya behaved abominably. From the defendant's bench, she threw mud at leading Chekists who had not previously been touched by the trial, including Comrade Peters. She turned out to have used his pure name in her blackmailing operations. She used to sit right in his office without any ceremony during his conversations with other intelligence agents. Now, she hinted at some dark pre-revolutionary past of his in Riga. That's the kind of snake she had turned into in 8 months, despite the fact that she had been with Chekists during those 8 months. What was to be done with such a woman? Here, Krylenko's position jibed completely with that of the Chekists. Until a firm regime has been established, and we are a long way from that being the case. Are we really? In the interests of the defense of the revolution, there is not and cannot be any sentence for Citizeness Uspenskaya other than her annihilation. He did not say to be shot. What he said was annihilation. But after all, Citizen Krylenko, she's just a young girl. Come on now, give her a 10, or maybe a 25. And maybe the system will be firmly established by then. How about it? But alas, in the interests of society and of the revolution, there is no other answer, nor can there be one, and the question cannot be put any other way. In the given case, detention isn't going to bear any fruit. She had sure rubbed the salt in. She knew too much, and Kozyrev had to be sacrificed too. They shot him. It was for the health of the others. Can it really be that some day we will read the old Lubyanka archives? No, they will burn them. They already have. As the reader can see for himself, this was a very unimportant case. We didn't have to dwell on it. But here is a different one. D. The case of the Churchmen, January the 11th to 16th, 1920. This case, in Krylenko's opinion, is going to have a suitable place in the annals of the Russian Revolution. Right there in the annals, indeed. It took 1 day to wring Kosyrev's neck, but in this case they dragged things out for 5 whole days. The principal defendants were A.D. Samarin, a famous man in Russia, the former chief procurator of the Synod, a man who had tried to liberate the church from the Tsar's yoke, an enemy of Rasputin, whom Rasputin had forced out of office. But accuser Krylenko saw no difference whatever between Samarin and Rasputin. Kuznetsov, professor of church law at Moscow University, the Moscow archpriests Uspensky and Tsvetkov. The accuser himself had this to say about Tsvetkov: an important public figure, perhaps the best that the clergy could produce, a philanthropist. Their guilt lay in creating the Moscow Council of United Parishes, which had in turn recruited, from among believers 40 to 80 years old, a voluntary guard for the Patriarch, unarmed, of course, which had set up permanent day and night watches in his residence, who were charged with the responsibility, in the event of danger from the authorities to the Patriarch, of assembling the people by ringing the church alarm bells and by telephone, so that a whole crowd might follow wherever the Patriarch might be taken and beg, and there's your counter-revolution for you, the Council of People's Commissars to release him. What an ancient Russian, holy Russian, scheme, to assemble the people by ringing the alarm bells, and proceed in a crowd with a petition. And the accuser was astonished. What danger threatened the Patriarch? Why had plans been made to defend him? Well, of course, it was really no more than the fact that the Cheka had for 2 years been conducting extrajudicial reprisals against undesirables, the fact that only a short while before 4 Red Army men in Kiev had killed the Metropolitan, the fact that the Patriarch's case had already been worked up and completed, and all that remained was to bring it before the Rev Tribunal, and it was only out of concern for the broad masses of workers and peasants, still under the influence of clerical propaganda, that we have left these, our class enemies, alone for the time being. How could Orthodox believers possibly be alarmed on the Patriarch's account? During those 2 years, Patriarch Tikhon had refused to keep silent. He had sent messages to the people's commissars, to the clergy, and to his flock. His messages were not accepted by the printers, but were copied on typewriters, the first samizdat. They exposed the annihilation of the innocents, the ruin of the country. How, therefore, could anyone really be concerned for the Patriarch's life? A second charge was brought against the defendants. Throughout the country, a census and requisition of church property was taking place. This was in addition to the closing of monasteries and the expropriation of church lands and properties. In question here were liturgical vessels, cups, and candelabra, and the Council of Parishes had disseminated an appeal to believers to resist the requisition, sounding the alarm on the church bells. And that was natural, after all. That, after all, was how they had defended the churches against the Tatars, too. And the third charge against them was their incessant, impudent dispatching of petitions to the Council of People's Commissars for relief from the desecration of the churches by local authorities, from crude blasphemy and violations of the law which guaranteed freedom of conscience. Even though no action was taken on these petitions, according to the testimony of Bonch Bruyevich, administrative officer of the Council of People's Commissars, they had discredited the local authorities. Taking into consideration all the violations committed by these defendants, what punishment could the accuser possibly demand for these awful crimes? Will not the reader's revolutionary conscience prompt the answer? To be shot, of course. And that is just what Krylenko did demand for Samarin and Kuznetsov. But while they were fussing around with these damned legal formalities and listening to too many long speeches from too many bourgeois lawyers, speeches which, for technical reasons, we will not cite here, it turned out that capital punishment had been abolished. What a fix! It just couldn't be. What had happened? It developed that Dzerzhinsky had issued this order to the Cheka without capital punishment. But had it been extended to the tribunals by the Council of People's Commissars? Not yet. Krylenko cheered up, and he continued to demand execution by shooting on the following grounds. Even if we suppose that the consolidation of the Republic has removed the immediacy of threat from such persons, it seems nonetheless indubitable that in this period of creative effort, a purge of the old turncoat leaders is required by revolutionary necessity. And further, Soviet power is proud of the decree of the Cheka abolishing the death penalty, but this still does not force us to conclude that the question of the abolition of capital punishment has been decided once and for all, for the entire period of Soviet rule. That was quite prophetic. Capital punishment would return, and very soon, too. After all, what a long line still remained to be rubbed out. Yes, including Krylenko, too, and many of his class brothers as well. And indeed, the tribunal was submissive and sentenced Samarin and Kuznetsov to be shot, but they did manage to tack on a recommendation for clemency, to be imprisoned in a concentration camp until the final victory over world imperialism. They would still be sitting there today. And as for the best that the clergy could produce, his sentence was 15 years, commuted to 5. Other defendants as well were dragged into this trial in order to add at least a little substance to the charges. Among them were some monks and teachers of Zvenigorod, involved in the Zvenigorod affair in the summer of 1918, but for some reason not brought to trial for a year and a half, or they might have been, but were now being tried again, since it was expedient. That summer, some Soviet officials had called on Father Superior Ion at the Svenigorod Monastery and ordered him, step lively there, to turn over to them the holy relics of St. Sava. Virgov, a former guards officer of the Tsar's household cavalry, who had suddenly undergone a spiritual conversion, given all his goods to the poor, and entered the monastery, but I do not in fact know whether he actually did distribute his goods to the poor. Yes, and if one admits the possibility of spiritual conversion, what then remains of class theory? The officials not only smoked inside the church, and evidently behind the altar screen as well, and of course refused to take off their caps, but one of them took Sava's skull in his hands and began to spit into it, to demonstrate that its sanctity was an illusion. And there were further acts of desecration. This led to the alarm bell being sounded, a popular uprising, and the killing of one or two of the officials. The others denied having committed any acts of desecration, including the spitting incident, and Krylenko accepted their denials. But which of us doesn't remember similar scenes? My first memory is of an event that took place when I was probably 3 or 4. The peaked heads, as they called the Czechists in their high-peaked Budeni caps, invaded a Kislovodsk church, sliced through the dumbstruck crowd of worshippers, and in their pointed caps went straight through the altar screen to the altar and stopped the service. Were these officials the ones on trial now? No, the monks. We beg the reader, throughout, to keep in mind, from 1918 on, our judicial custom determined that every Moscow trial, except of course the unjust trial of the Czechists, was by no means an isolated trial of an accidental concatenation of circumstances which had converged by accident. It was a landmark of judicial policy. It was a display window model whose specifications determined what product was good for the provinces too. It was a standard. It was like that one and only model solution up front in the arithmetic book for the school children to follow for themselves. Thus, when we say the trial of the churchmen, this must be understood in the multiple plural, many trials. And in fact, the supreme accuser himself willingly explains, such trials have rolled along through almost all the tribunals of the Republic. What language! They had taken place not long before in the tribunals in North Dvina, Tver, and Ryazan, in Saratov, Kazan, Ufa, Solvizhegodsk, and Tsarevokokshaisk. Trials were held of the clergy, the choirs, and the active members of the congregation, representatives of the ungrateful Orthodox Church liberated by the October Revolution. The reader will be aware of a conflict here. Why did many of these trials occur earlier than the Moscow model? This is simply a shortcoming of our exposition. The judicial and the extrajudicial persecution of the liberated church had begun well back in 1918, and judging by the Svenigorod affair, it had already reached a peak of intensity by that summer. In October 1918, Patriarch Tikhon had protested in a message to the Council of People's Commissars that there was no freedom to preach in the churches, and that many courageous priests have already paid for their preaching with the blood of martyrdom. You have laid your hands on church property collected by generations of believers, and you have not hesitated to violate their posthumous intent. The People's Commissars did not, of course, read the message, but the members of their administrative staff must have had a good laugh. Now they've really got something to reproach us with. Posthumous intent? We shit on your ancestors. We are only interested in descendants. They are executing bishops, priests, monks, and nuns who are guilty of nothing on the basis of indiscriminate charges of indefinite and vaguely counter-revolutionary offenses. True, with the approach of Denikin and Kolchak, this was stopped, so as to make it easier for Orthodox believers to defend the revolution. But hardly had the Civil War begun to die down than they took up their cudgels against the Church again, and the cases started rolling through the tribunals once more. In 1920 they struck at the Trinity St. Sergius Monastery and went straight to the holy relics of that chauvinist Sergius of Radonej, and hauled them off to a Moscow museum. The Patriarch cited Klyuchevsky. The gates of the monastery of the saint will shut, and the icon lamps will be extinguished over his sepulchre only when we shall have lost every vestige of that spiritual and moral strength willed to us by such great builders of the Russian land as St. Sergius. Klyuchevsky did not imagine that the loss would occur almost in his own lifetime. The Patriarch asked for an appointment with the chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, in the hope of persuading him not to touch the holy monastery and the relics, for after all the church was separate from the state. The answer came back that the chairman was occupied in discussing important business and that the appointment could not be arranged for the near future, nor for the distant future either. The People's Commissariat of Justice issued a directive dated August the 25th, 1920, for the liquidation of relics of all kinds, since they were a significant obstacle to the resplendent movement toward a new, just society. Pursuing further Krylenko's own selection of cases, let us also examine the case tried in the Werktrib, in other words, the Supreme Tribunal. How affectionately they abbreviated words within their intimate circle, but how they roared out for us little insects, "Rise! The court is in session!" E. The case of the Tactical Center, August the 16th to 20th, 1920. In this case, there were 28 defendants present, plus additional defendants who were being tried in absentia because they weren't around. At the very beginning of his impassioned speech, in a voice not yet grown hoarse, and in phrases illumined by class analysis, the Supreme Accuser informs us that in addition to the landowners and the capitalists, there existed and there continues to exist one additional social stratum, the social characteristics of which have long since been under consideration by the representatives of revolutionary socialism. In other words, to be or not to be. This stratum is the so-called intelligentsia. In this trial we shall be concerned with the judgment of history on the activity of the Russian intelligentsia and with the verdict of the revolution on it. The narrow limits of our investigation prevent our comprehending exactly the particular manner in which the representatives of revolutionary socialism were taking under consideration the fate of the so-called intelligentsia and what specifically they were planning for it. However, we take comfort in the fact that these materials have been published, that they are accessible to everyone, and that they can be assembled in any required detail. Therefore, solely to understand the overall atmosphere of the Republic, we shall recall the opinion of the chairman of the Council of People's Commissars in the years when all these tribunal sessions were going on. In a letter to Gorky on September the 15th, 1919, which we have already cited, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin replied to Gorky's attempts to intercede in the arrests of members of the intelligentsia, among them, evidently, some of the defendants in this trial, and commenting on the bulk of the Russian intelligentsia of those years, the close-to-the-cadets intelligentsia, he wrote, "In actual fact, they are not the nation's brains, but shit." Lenin, 5th edition, volume 51, page 48. On another occasion he said to Gorky, "If we break too many pots, it will be its, the intelligentsia's, fault." If the intelligentsia wants justice, why doesn't it come over to us? I've gotten one bullet from the intelligentsia myself. In other words, from Kaplan. On the basis of these feelings, he expressed his mistrust and hostility toward the intelligentsia, rotten liberal, pious, the slovenliness so customary among educated people. He believed the intelligentsia was always short-sighted, that it had betrayed the cause of the workers. But when had the intelligentsia ever sworn loyalty to the cause of the workers, the dictatorship of the workers? This mockery of the intelligentsia, this contempt for the intelligentsia, was subsequently adopted with enthusiasm by the publicists and the newspapers of the 20s, and was absorbed into the current of day-to-day life. And in the end, the members of the intelligentsia accepted it too, cursing their eternal thoughtlessness, their eternal duality, their eternal spinelessness, and their hopeless lagging behind the times. And this was just. the voice of the accusing power echoed and re-echoed beneath the vaults of the Werktrib, returning us to the defendant's bench. This social stratum has, during recent years, undergone the trial of universal re-evaluation. Yes, re-evaluation, as was so often said at the time. And how did that re-evaluation occur? Here's how. The Russian intelligentsia, which entered the crucible of the revolution with slogans of power for the people, so it had something to it after all, emerged from it an ally of the black, not even white, generals, and a hired and obedient agent of European imperialism. The intelligentsia trampled on its own banners, as in the army, yes, and covered them with mud. How indeed can we not cry out our hearts in repentance? How can we not lacerate our chests with our fingernails? And the only reason why there is no need to deal out the death blow to its individual representatives is that this social group has outlived its time. Here, at the start of the 20th century, what power of foresight! Oh, scientific revolutionaries! However, the intelligentsia had to be finished off anyway. Throughout the 20s, they kept finishing them off and finishing them off. We examine with hostility the 28 individual allies of the black generals, the hirelings of European imperialism, and we are especially aroused by the stench of the word center. Now we see a tactical center, now a national center, and now a right center. And in our recollection of the trials of 2 decades, centers keep creeping in all the time. Centers and centers, engineers' centers, Menshevik centers, Trotskyite, Zinovьevite centers, rightist Bukharinite centers. But all of them are crushed, all crushed, and that is the only reason you and I are still alive. Wherever there is a center, of course, the hand of imperialism can be found. True, we feel a measure of relief when we learn that the tactical center on this occasion was not an organization, that it did not have 1, statutes, 2, a program, 3, membership dues. So what did it have? Here's what. They used to meet. Goose pimples up and down the back. And when they met, they undertook to familiarize themselves with one another's point of view. I see chills. The charges were extremely serious and were supported by the evidence. There were 2 pieces of evidence to corroborate the charges against 28 accused individuals. There were 2 letters from people who were not present in court because they were abroad, Mayakotin and Fyodorov. They were absent, but until the October Revolution they had been members of the same committees as those who were present, a circumstance that gave us the right to equate those who were absent with those who were present. And their letters dealt with their disagreements with Denikin on certain trivial questions. The peasant question, we are not told what these differences were, but they were evidently advising Denikin to give the land to the peasants. The Jewish question, they were evidently advising him not to return to the previous restrictions. The federated nationalities question, enough said, clear. The question of the structure of the government, democracy rather than dictatorship, and similar matters. And what conclusion did this evidence suggest? Very simple. It proved the fact of correspondence, and it also proved the agreement, the unanimity of those present with Denikin. But there were also direct accusations against those present, that they had exchanged information with acquaintances who lived in outlying areas, Kiev, for example, which were not under the control of the Central Soviet authorities. In other words, this used to be Russia, let's say, but then in the interests of world revolution we ceded this one piece to Germany.
This book is continued at this point, on the other side of this cassette. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1, Section 2, continued. Cassette 2, Side 2.
But there were also direct accusations against those present, that they had exchanged information with acquaintances who lived in outlying areas, Kiev, for example, which were not under the control of the Central Soviet authorities. In other words, this used to be Russia, let's say, but then in the interests of world revolution we ceded this one piece to Germany. and people continued to exchange letters. "How are you doing there, Ivan Ivanitch? Here's how things are going with us. N.M. Kishkin, a member of the Central Committee of the Cadets, was so brazen as to try to justify himself right from the defendant's bench. A man doesn't want to be blind. He tries to find out everything he can about what's going on everywhere." To find out everything about what's going on everywhere? He doesn't want to be blind? Well, all one can say is that the accuser correctly described their actions as treason. Treason to Soviet power. But their most heinous acts were something else again. In the midst of the Civil War, they wrote books, composed memoranda, and projects. Yes, as experts in constitutional law, financial science, economic relationships, the system of justice, and education, they wrote works. And as one might easily guess, their works were not based on earlier works by Lenin, Trotsky, and Bukharin. Professor Kotlяревsky wrote on the federal structure of Russia. V.I. Stemkovsky on the agrarian question, no doubt without collectivization. V.S. Muralevich on education in the future Russia. N.N. Vinogradsky on economics, and the great biologist N.K. Koltsov, who never received anything from the motherland except persecution and execution, allowed all those bourgeois bigshots to get together in his institute for their discussions. N.D. Kondratyev was included here also. In 1931 he was condemned once and for all in connection with TKP, the fictitious Working Peasants' Party. Our accuser's heart jumps right out of our chest, outrunning the sentence. Well, what punishment was adequate for these assistants to the general? Just one, of course, to be shot. That was not merely what the accuser demanded, it was the sentence of the tribunal. Alas, it was later commuted to concentration camp until the end of the Civil War. And indeed, the defendants' guilt consisted in the fact that they hadn't sat in their own corners sucking on their quarter-pound of bread, that they had talked things over and reached agreements as to what the state structure should be after the fall of the Soviet regime. In contemporary scientific language, this is known as the study of the alternative possibility. The voice of the accuser thundered, but we hear some kind of crack in it, as if his eyes were searching the rostrum, looking for another piece of paper. A quotation, perhaps. Give it to him on tiptoe. Quick, quick. Give him one at random, from some other trial. It's not important. Wasn't this the one, Nikolai Vasilievich Krylenko? For us, the concept of torture inheres in the very fact of holding political prisoners in prison. So that's it. It is torture to keep political prisoners in prison. And the accuser said so. What a generous view. A new jurisprudence is arising. And further, struggle against the Tsarist government was second nature to them, the politicals, and not to struggle against Tsarism was something of which they were incapable. What's that? They were incapable of not studying alternative possibilities? Perhaps thinking was first nature to the intellectual. Alas, through stupidity, they had shoved the wrong quotation at him. Now, wasn't that a mix-up for you? But Nikolai Vasilievich was already off to the races. And even if the defendants here in Moscow did not lift a finger, and it looks very much as though that's the way it was, at such a moment, nevertheless, even a conversation over a teacup as to the kind of system that should replace the Soviet system, which is allegedly about to fall, is a counter-revolutionary act. During the Civil War, not only is any kind of action against Soviet power a crime, but the fact of inaction is also criminal. Well, now everything is comprehensible. Everything is clear. They are being sentenced to death for inaction. For a cup of tea. The Petrograd intellectuals, for example, decided that in the event of Yudenich's taking the city, they would first of all concern themselves with convening a democratic municipal Duma, in other words, to safeguard the city against a possible dictatorship. Krylenko: I would like to shout at them, it was your duty to think first of all how you might die in battle, so as not to allow Yudenich into the city. But they didn't die in battle. Nor, in fact, did Nikolai Vasilievich Krylenko. In addition, there were certain defendants who knew about all this talk and yet kept silent, did not write denunciations. In our contemporary lingo, He knew, but he didn't tell. And here is another real example, not merely of inaction, but of actively criminal action. Through L.N. Khrushcheva, a member of the political Red Cross, and there she was, on the defendant's bench, some of the other defendants had raised money to help the Butyrki prisoners. One can just picture that flood of capital pouring into the prison commissary. And they had supplied various articles, too. Yes, indeed, just look. Woolens, too, perhaps. There were no bounds to their evil doing, nor would there be any limits to their proletarian punishment. As when a cinema projector starts slowing down, 28 pre-revolutionary male and female faces flicker past us in a film that's fuzzy and askew. We didn't notice their expressions. Were they frightened, contemptuous, proud? We don't have their answers. Their last words are missing because of technical considerations. But making up for this lack, the accuser croons to us. From beginning to end, it was self-flagellation and repentance for the mistakes they committed, the political instability and the interim nature of the intelligentsia. Yes, here comes another one, interim nature. Completely justified that Marxist evaluation of the intelligentsia made by the Bolsheviks. I don't know. Perhaps they did engage in self-flagellation. Perhaps they didn't. Perhaps the passion to save one's life at any cost had already come into being. Perhaps the old dignity of the intelligentsia had still been maintained. I don't know. Who was that young woman flashing past? That was Tolstoy's daughter, Alexandra. Krylenko asked her, "What did you do during these conversations?" And she answered, "I attended to the samovar." 3 years of concentration camp. And who was that man over there? His face was familiar. It was Sava Morozov. But listen here, after all, he gave the Bolsheviks all that money. And now he has handed a little to these people? 3 years in prison, but released on probation. Let that be a lesson to him. He would soon cut his own throat. And that's how the sun of our freedom rose. It was as just such a well-nourished little imp that our Octoberist child, Law, began to grow. Today we don't remember this at all. Chapter 9. The Law Becomes a Man. Our review has already grown, yet we have in fact hardly begun. All the big and famous trials are still ahead of us, but their basic lines have already been indicated. So let us stick with our law while it is still in its Boy Scout stage. Let us recall one long-forgotten case, which was not even political. F. The case of Glovetop. May 1921. This case was important because it involved engineers, or as they had been christened in the terminology of the times, specialists, or spetsi. Glovetop was the main fuels committee. 1921 was the most difficult of all the 4 winters of the Civil War. Nothing was left for fuel, and trains simply couldn't get to the next station. And there were cold and famine in the capitals, and a wave of strikes in the factories. Strikes which, incidentally, have been completely wiped out of our history books by now. Who was to blame? That was a famous question. Who is to blame? Well, obviously not the overall leadership, and not even the local leadership. That was important. If the comrades who were often brought in from outside, that is, the communist leaders, did not have a correct grasp of the business at hand, then it was the engineers, or spetsi, who were supposed to outline for them the correct approach to the problem. And this meant that it was not the leaders who were to blame. Those who had worked out the calculations were to blame. Those who had refigured the calculations, those who had calculated the plan, which consisted of how to produce food and heat with zeros. Those to blame weren't the ones who compelled, but the ones who calculated. If the planning turned out to be inflated, the spetsi were the ones to blame. Because the figures did not jibe, this was the fault of the spetsi, not of the Council of Labor and Defense, and not even of the responsible men in charge of Glovetop, the main fuels committee. If there was no coal, firewood, or petroleum, it was because the Spetsy had brought about a mixed-up, chaotic situation, and it was their own fault that they hadn't resisted the urgent telephonograms from Rykov and the government, and had issued and allotted fuels outside the scope of the plan. The Spetsy were to blame for everything, but the proletarian court was not merciless with them. Their sentences were lenient. Of course, an inner hostility to those cursed Spetsy remains in proletarian hearts, but one can't get along without them. Everything goes to rack and ruin, and the tribunal doesn't persecute them, and Krylenko even says that from 1920 on, there is no question of any sabotage. The Spetsy are to blame, but not out of malice on their part. It's simply because they are inept. They aren't able to do any better. Under capitalism, they hadn't learned to work, or else they were simply egotists and bribe-takers. And so, at the beginning of the Reconstruction period, a surprising tendency toward leniency could be observed in regard to the engineers. The year 1922, the first year of peace, was rich in public trials, so rich that almost this entire chapter will be devoted to that year alone. People are surprised. The war has ended, and yet there is an increase in court activity. But in 1945, too, and in 1948, the dragon became very, very energetic. Is there not perhaps a simple sort of law in this? Although in December 1921 the Ninth Congress of the Soviets decreed that the authority of the Checker be narrowed, and in consequence its authority was indeed narrowed, and it was renamed the GPU as early as October 1922, the powers of the GPU were broadened again, and in December Dzerzhinsky told a Pravda correspondent, "Now we need to keep watch with particular vigilance over anti-Soviet currents and groupings. The GPU has reduced its apparatus but strengthened it in terms of quality." And at the beginning of 1922 we must not bypass G, the case of the suicide of engineer Oldenburger, tried before the Werktrib, the Supreme Tribunal, in February 1922. This case is forgotten, insignificant, and totally atypical. It was atypical because its entire scale was that of a single life that had already ended, and if that life hadn't ended, it would have been that very engineer, yes, and 10 more with him, forming a centre who would have sat before the Werktrib. In that event, the case would have been altogether typical. But as it was, an outstanding party comrade, Sidelnikov, sat on the defendant's bench, and with him 2 members of the RKI, the Workers' and Peasants' Inspection, and 2 trade union officials. But like Chekhov's far-off broken harp-string, there was something plaintive in this trial. It was in its own way an early predecessor of the Shakhty and Promparty trials. V.V. Oldenburger had worked for 30 years in the Moscow water supply system, and had evidently become its chief engineer back at the beginning of the century. Even though the silver age of art, 4 state dumas, 3 wars, and 3 revolutions had come and gone, all Moscow drank Oldenburger's water. The Acmeists and the Futurists, the reactionaries and the revolutionaries, the military cadets and the Red Guards, the Council of People's Commissars, the Checker, and the Workers' and Peasants' Inspection, all had drunk Oldenburger's pure, cold water. He had never married, and he had no children. His whole life had consisted of that one water supply system. In 1905, he refused to permit the soldiers of the Guard near the water supply conduits, because the soldiers, out of clumsiness, might break the pipes or machinery. On the 2nd day of the February Revolution, he said to his workers that that was enough, the revolution was over, and they should all go back to their jobs. The water must flow. And during the October fighting in Moscow, he had only one concern, to safeguard the water supply system. His colleagues went on strike in answer to the Bolshevik coup d'etat, and invited him to take part in the strike with them. His reply was, "On the operational side, please forgive me, I am not on strike. In everything else well, yes, I am on strike." He accepted money for the strikers from the strike committee, and gave them a receipt, but he himself dashed off to get a sleeve to repair a broken pipe. But despite this, he was an enemy. Here's what he had said to one of the workers. "The Soviet regime won't last 2 weeks. There was a new political situation preceding the announcement of the new economic policy, and in this context Krylenko could allow himself some frank talk before the VEF trib. It was not only the Spetsy who thought that way at the time, that is what we ourselves thought more than once. But despite this, Oldenburger was an enemy. Just as Comrade Lenin had told us, to keep watch over the bourgeois specialists, we need a watchdog, the RKI, the Workers' and Peasants' Inspection. They began by assigning 2 such watchdogs to Oldenburger on a full-time basis. One of them, Makarov Zemlyansky, a swindler and a former clerk in the water system, had been fired for improper conduct and had entered the service of the RKI because they paid better. He got promoted to the Central People's Commissariat because the pay there was even better, and from that height he had returned to check up on his former chief and take hearty vengeance on the man who had wronged him. Then, of course, the local party committee, that matchless defender of the workers' interests, wasn't dozing either, and communists were put in charge of the water system. Only workers are to hold the top positions, there are to be only communists at leadership level, and the wisdom of this view was confirmed by the given trial. The Moscow party organization also kept its eyes on the water supply system, and behind it stood the Cheka. In our own time we built our army on the basis of a healthy feeling of class enmity. In its name we do not entrust even one responsible position to people who do not belong to our camp, without assigning them a commissar. And so they all immediately began to order the chief engineer about, to supervise him, to give him instructions, and to shift the engineering personnel around without his knowledge. They broke up the whole nest of businessmen. But they did not, even so, safeguard the water supply system. Things didn't go better with it, but worse. So slyly had that gang of engineers contrived to carry out an evil scheme. Even more, overcoming his intellectual's interim nature, as a result of which he had never in his life expressed himself sharply, Oldenburger made so bold as to describe as stupid stubbornness the actions of the new chief of the water supply system, Zenyuk, to Krylenko, a profoundly likable person on the basis of his internal structure. It was at this point that it became clear that Engineer Oldenburger was consciously betraying the interests of the workers and that he was a direct and open enemy of the dictatorship of the working class. They started bringing inspection commissions into the water supply system, but the commissions found that everything was in good order and that water was being supplied on a normal basis. The RKI men, the Rabkrinovtsi, refused to be satisfied with this. They kept pouring report after report into the RKI. Oldenburger simply wanted to ruin, spoil, break down the water supply system for political purposes, but he was unable to. Well, they put what obstacles in his way that they could. They prevented wasteful boiler repairs and replacing the wooden tanks with concrete ones. At meetings of the water supply system workers, the leaders began saying openly that their chief engineer was the soul of organized technical sabotage, and that he should not be believed, that he should be resisted at every point. Despite all this, the operation of the water supply system not only didn't improve, but deteriorated. What was particularly offensive to the hereditary proletarian psychology of the officials of the Workers' and Peasants' Inspection and of the trade unions was that the majority of the workers at the pumping stations had been infected with petty bourgeois psychology, and unable to recognize Oldenburger's sabotage, had come to his defense. At this point, elections to the Moscow Soviet were being held, and the workers nominated Oldenburger as the candidate of the water supply system, against whom, of course, the party cell backed its own party candidate. However, this turned out to be futile because of the chief engineer's fraudulent authority with the workers. Nonetheless, the party cell brought up the question with the district party committee on all levels, and announced at a general meeting that Oldenburger is the center and soul of sabotage and will be our political enemy in the Moscow Soviet. The workers responded with an uproar and shouts of, "Untrue! Lies!" And at that point the secretary of the party committee, Comrade Sedelnikov, flung right in the faces of the 1,000-headed proletariat there, "I am not even going to talk to such Black Hundred reactionary pogrom makers. That is to say, we'll talk to you somewhere else." Party measures were also taken. They expelled the chief engineer from, no less, the Collegium for Administration of the Water System, and kept him under constant investigation, continually summoned him before a multitude of commissions and sub-commissions, kept interrogating him and giving him assignments that were to be urgently carried out. Every time he failed to appear, it was entered in the record in case of a future trial. And through the Council of Labor and Defense, Chairman Comrade Lenin, they got an extraordinary troika appointed to the water system. It consisted of representatives of the RKI, the Council of Trade Unions, and Comrade Kuibyshev. And for the 4th year, the water kept right on flowing through the pipes, and Muscovites kept on drinking it and didn't notice anything wrong. Then, Comrade Sedelnikov wrote an article for the newspaper Ekonomicheskaya Sdin. In view of the rumors disturbing the public in regard to the catastrophic state of the water mains, and he reported many new and alarming rumors, even that the water system was pumping water underground and was intentionally washing away the foundations of all Moscow, set there by Ivan Kalita in the 14th century. They summoned the commission of the Moscow Soviet. The commission found that the state of the water system was satisfactory and that its technical direction was efficient. Oldenburger denied all the accusations. And then Sedelnikov placidly declared, "I had set myself the task of stirring up a fuss about this matter in order to get the question of the Spetsi taken up." What remained for the leaders of the workers to do at this point? What was the final infallible method? A denunciation to the Cheka. Sedelnikov resorted to just that. He painted a picture of the conscious wrecking of the water system by Oldenburger. He did not have the slightest doubt that a counter-revolutionary organization existed in the water system in the heart of Red Moscow, and furthermore a catastrophic situation at the Rublevo water tower. At this point, Oldenburger was guilty of a tactless act of rudeness, the outburst of a spineless interim intellectual. They had refused to authorize his order for new boilers from abroad, and at the time, in Russia, it was quite impossible to fix the old ones. So, Oldenburger committed suicide. It had been just too much for one man. After all, he hadn't undergone the conditioning for that sort of thing. The cause was not lost, however. They could find a counter-revolutionary organization without him. RKI men would now undertake to expose the whole thing. Some concealed maneuvering went on for 2 months, but such was the spirit at the beginning of the NEP that a lesson had to be taught both one side and the other. So there was a trial in the Supreme Tribunal. Krylenko was moderately severe. Krylenko was moderately merciless. He was understanding. The Russian worker, of course, was right to see in every person not of his own class someone more likely to be an enemy than a friend. Nevertheless, given the further change in our practical and general policy, perhaps we must be prepared for still greater concessions, for retreating and maneuvering. Perhaps the party will be forced to adopt a tactical program of action which the primitive logic of honest, dedicated warriors is going to protest. Well, it's a fact. The workers who testified against Comrade Sedelnikov and the RKI men were easily brushed off by the tribunal, and the defendant Sedelnikov replied brazenly to the threats of the accuser. "Comrade Krylenko, I know all those articles, but after all, no one is judging class enemies here, and those articles relate to class enemies." However, Krylenko laid it on good and thick. Deliberately false denunciations to state institutions, in circumstances aggravating guilt, such as a personal grudge and the settling of personal accounts, the abuse of an official position, political irresponsibility, abuse of power and of the authority of government officials and members of the Russian Communist Party, Bolsheviks, disorganization of the work of the water supply system, injury done the Moscow Soviet and Soviet Russia because there were few such specialists, and it was impossible to find replacements for them. And we won't even begin to speak of the individual personal loss. In our time, when struggle is the chief content of our lives, we have somehow grown used to not counting these irrevocable losses. The Supreme Revolutionary Tribunal must utter its weighty word. Punishment must be assessed with all due severity. We didn't come here just to crack jokes. Good Lord, now what are they going to get? Could it really be? My reader has gotten used to prompting. All of them to be And that is absolutely correct. All of them were to be publicly shamed, bearing in mind their sincere repentance. All of them to be sentenced to ostracism and ridicule. 2 truths. And Sedelnikov, allegedly, got 1 year in jail. You will just have to forgive me if I don't believe it. Oh, you bards of the 20s, painting your pictures of their bright and bubbling happiness. Even those who touched only their farthest edge, who touched them only in childhood, will never forget them. And those plug-uglies, those fat faces, busy persecuting engineers, in the 20s too, they ate their bellies full. And now we see also that they had been busy from 1918 on. In the 2 trials following, we will take leave of our favorite supreme accuser for a while. He is occupied with his preparations for the major trial of the SRs. The provincial trials of the SRs took place even earlier, such as the one in Saratov in 1919. This spectacular trial aroused a great deal of emotion in Europe beforehand, and the People's Commissariat of Justice was suddenly taken aback. After all, we had been trying people for 4 years without any code, neither a new one nor an old one. And in all probability, Krylenko himself was concerned about the code, too. Everything had to be neatly tied up ahead of time. The coming church trials were internal. They didn't interest progressive Europe, and they could be conducted without a code. We have already had an opportunity to observe that the separation of church and state was so construed by the state that the churches themselves and everything that hung in them, was installed in them and painted in them, belonged to the state, and the only church remaining was that church which, in accordance with the Scriptures, lay within the heart. And in 1918, when political victory seemed to have been attained faster and more easily than had been expected, they had pressed right on to confiscate church property. However, this leap had aroused too fierce a wave of popular indignation. In the heat of the Civil War, it was not very intelligent to create, in addition, an internal front against the believers. And it proved necessary to postpone for the time being the dialogue between the communists and the Christians. At the end of the Civil War, and as its natural consequence, an unprecedented famine developed in the Volga area. They give it only 2 lines in the official histories because it doesn't add a very ornamental touch to the wreaths of the victors in that war. But the famine existed nonetheless, to the point of cannibalism, to the point at which parents ate their own children. Such a famine as even Russia had never known, even in the time of troubles in the early 17th century. Because at that time, as the historians testify, unthreshed ricks of grain survived intact beneath the snow and ice for several years. Just one film about famine might throw a new light on everything we saw and everything we know about the Revolution and the Civil War. But there are no films and no novels and no statistical research. The effort is to forget it. It does not embellish. Besides, we have come to blame the kulaks as the cause of every famine. And just who were the kulaks in the midst of such collective death? V.G. Korolenko, in his Letters to Lunacharsky, which, despite Lunacharsky's promise, were never officially published in the Soviet Union, explains to us Russia's total epidemic descent into famine and destitution. They were published in Paris in 1922 and in the Soviet Union in Samizdat in 1967. It was the result of productivity having been reduced to 0. The working hands were all carrying guns, and the result also of the peasants' utter lack of trust and hope that even the smallest part of the harvest might be left for them. Yes, and some day someone will also count up those many carloads of food supplies rolling on and on for many, many months to Imperial Germany under the terms of the peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk, from a Russia which had been deprived of a protesting voice from the very provinces where famine would strike, so that Germany could fight to the end in the West. There was a direct, immediate chain of cause and effect. The Volga peasants had to eat their children because we were so impatient about putting up with the Constituent Assembly. But political genius lies in extracting success even from the people's ruin. A brilliant idea was born. After all, 3 billiard balls can be pocketed with one shot. So now let the priests feed the Volga region. They are Christians. They are generous. 1. If they refuse, we will blame the whole famine on them and destroy the church. 2. If they agree, we will clean out the churches. 3. In either case, we will replenish our stocks of foreign exchange and precious metals. Yes, and the idea was probably inspired by the actions of the church itself. As Patriarch Tikhon himself had testified back in August 1921, at the beginning of the famine, the church had created diocesan and all-Russian committees for aid to the starving and had begun to collect funds. But to have permitted any direct help to go straight from the church into the mouths of those who were starving would have undermined the dictatorship of the proletariat. The committees were banned, and the funds they had collected were confiscated and turned over to the state treasury. The Patriarch had also appealed to the Pope in Rome and to the Archbishop of Canterbury for assistance. But he was rebuked for this, too, on the grounds that only the Soviet authorities had the right to enter into discussions with foreigners. Yes, indeed. And what was there to be alarmed about? The newspapers wrote that the government itself had all the necessary means to cope with the famine. Meanwhile, in the Volga region, they were eating grass, the soles of shoes, and gnawing door jambs. And finally, in December 1921, Pomgol, the State Commission for Famine Relief, proposed that the churches help the starving by donating church valuables, not all, but those not required for liturgical rites. The Patriarch agreed. Pomgol issued a directive. All gifts must be strictly voluntary. On February the 19th, 1922, the Patriarch issued a pastoral letter permitting the parish councils to make gifts of objects that did not have liturgical and ritual significance. And in this way, matters could again have simply degenerated into a compromise that would have frustrated the will of the proletariat, just as it once had been by the Constituent Assembly, and still was in all the chatterbox European parliaments. The thought came in a stroke of lightning. The thought came, and a decree followed. A decree of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee on February the 26th. All valuables were to be requisitioned from the churches for the starving. The Patriarch wrote to Kalinin, who did not reply. Then, on February the 28th, the Patriarch issued a new, fateful pastoral letter. From the Church's point of view, such a measure is sacrilege, and we cannot approve the requisition. From the distance of a half-century, it is easy to reproach the Patriarch. Of course, the leaders of the Christian Church ought not to have been distracted by wondering whether other resources might not be available to the Soviet government, and who it was who had driven the Volga to famine. They ought not to have clung to those treasures, since the possibility of a new fortress of faith arising, if it existed at all, did not depend on them. But one has also to picture the situation of that unfortunate Patriarch, not elected to his post until after the October Revolution, who had for a few short years led a church that was always persecuted, restricted, under fire, and whose preservation had been entrusted to him. But right then and there, a surefire campaign of persecution began in the papers, directed against the Patriarch and high church authorities, who were strangling the Volga region with the bony hand of famine. And the more firmly the Patriarch clung to his position, the weaker it became. In March, a movement to relinquish the valuables, to come to an agreement with the government, began even among the clergy. Their still undispelled qualms were expressed to Kalinin by Bishop Antonin Granovsky, a member of the Central Committee of Pomgol. The believers fear that the church valuables may be used for other purposes, more limited and alien to their hearts. Knowing the general principles of our progressive doctrine, the experienced reader will agree that this was indeed very probable. After all, the Comintern's needs and those of the East in the course of being liberated were no less acute than those of the Volga. The Petrograd Metropolitan, Veniamin was similarly impelled by a mood of trust. "This belongs to God, and we will give all of it by ourselves." But forced requisitions were wrong. Let the sacrifice be of our own free will. He, too, wanted verification by the clergy and the believers, to watch over the church valuables up to the very moment when they were transformed into bread for the starving. And in all this, he was tormented lest he violate the censoring will of the Patriarch. In Petrograd, things seemed to be working out peacefully. The atmosphere at the session of the Petrograd Pomgol on March the 5th, 1922, was even joyful, according to the testimony of an eyewitness. Veniamin announced, "The Orthodox Church is prepared to give everything to help the starving." It saw sacrilege only in forced requisition. But in that case, requisition was unnecessary. Kanachikov, chairman of the Petrograd Pomgol, gave his assurances that this would produce a favorable attitude toward the Church on the part of the Soviet government. Not very likely, that. In a burst of good feeling, everyone stood up, the Metropolitan said. "The heaviest burden is division and enmity. But the time will come when the Russian people will unite. I myself, at the head of the worshippers, will remove the cover of precious metals and precious stones from the icon of the Holy Virgin of Kazan. I will shed sweet tears on it and give it away." He gave his blessing to the Bolshevik members of Pomgol, and they saw him to the door with bared heads. The newspaper, Petrogradskaya Pravda, in its issues of March 8th, 9th, and 10th, confirmed the peaceful, successful outcome of the talks and spoke favorably of the Metropolitan. See the articles entitled "The Church and the Famine," and "How the Church Valuables Will be Requisitioned." In Smolny, they agreed that the church vessels and icon coverings would be melted down into ingots in the presence of the believers. Again, things were getting fouled up with some kind of compromise. The noxious fumes of Christianity were poisoning the revolutionary will. That kind of unity and that way of handing over the valuables were not what the starving people of the Volga needed. The spineless membership of the Petrograd Pomgol was changed. The newspapers began to howl about the evil pastors and princes of the church, and the representatives of the church were told, "We don't need your donations, and there won't be any negotiations with you. Everything belongs to the government, and the government will take whatever it considers necessary." And so forcible requisitions, accompanied by strife, began in Petrograd, as they did everywhere else. And this provided the legal basis for initiating trials of the clergy. I have taken this material from Essays on the History of the Troubles of the Church by Anatoly Levitin, Part 1, Samizdat, 1962, and from the stenographic notes on the questioning of Patriarch Tikhon, Trial Record, Volume 5. H. The Moscow Church Trial, April the 26th to May the 7th, 1922. This took place in the Polytechnic Museum. The court was the Moscow Rev Tribunal under presiding Judge Beck. The prosecutors were Lunin and Longinov. There were 17 defendants, including archpriests and laymen, accused of disseminating the Patriarch's proclamation. This charge was more important than the question of surrendering or not surrendering church valuables. Archpriest A.N. Zaozersky had surrendered all the valuables in his own church, but he defended in principle the Patriarch's appeal regarding forced requisition as sacrilege, and he became the central personage in the trial, and would shortly be shot. All of which went to prove that what was important was not to feed the starving, but to make use of a convenient opportunity to break the back of the church. On May the 5th, Patriarch Tikhon was summoned to the tribunal as a witness. Even though the public was represented only by a carefully selected audience, 1922 in this respect differing little from 1937 and 1968, nonetheless the stamp of old Russia was still so deep, and the Soviet stamp was still so superficial, that on the Patriarch's entrance, more than half of those present rose to receive his blessing. Tikhon took on himself the entire blame for writing and disseminating his appeal. The presiding judge of the tribunal tried to elicit a different line of testimony from him. "But it isn't possible. Did you really write it in your own hand, all the lines? You probably just signed it. And who actually wrote it? And who were your advisers? And then, why did you mention in the appeal the persecution to which the newspapers are subjecting you? After all, they are persecuting you, and why should we hear about it? What did you want to express?" The Patriarch: "That is something you will have to ask the people who started the persecution. What objectives were they pursuing?" The presiding judge: "But that, after all, has nothing to do with religion." The Patriarch: "It has historical significance." The presiding judge: "Referring to the fact that the decree was published while you were in the midst of talks with Pomgol, you used the expression 'behind your back.'" The Patriarch: "Yes." Presiding judge: "You therefore consider that the Soviet government acted incorrectly?" A crushing argument. It will be repeated 1,000,000 times more in the night-time offices of interrogators, and we will never answer as simply and straightforwardly as the Patriarch. Yes. The presiding judge: "Do you consider the state's laws obligatory or not?" The Patriarch: "Yes, I recognize them to the extent that they do not contradict the rules of piety." Oh, if only everyone had answered just that way, our whole history would have been different. A debate about church law followed. The Patriarch explained that if the church itself surrendered its valuables, it was not sacrilege, but if they were taken away against the church's will, it was. His appeal had not prohibited giving the valuables at all, but had only declared that seizing them against the will of the church was to be condemned. But that's what we wanted, expropriation against the will of the church. Comrade Beck, the presiding judge, was astounded. "Which, in the last analysis, is more important to you, the laws of the church or the point of view of the Soviet government?" The expected reply: "The Soviet government." "Very well, so it was sacrilege according to the laws of the church," exclaimed the accuser. "But what was it from the point of view of mercy?" For the first and last time for another 50 years, that banal word, mercy, was spoken before a tribunal. Then there was a philological analysis of the word sviatotatstvo, meaning sacrilege, derived from sviato, meaning holy, and tat, meaning thief. The accuser: "So that means that we, the representatives of the Soviet government, are thieves of holy things?" A prolonged uproar in the hall, a recess, the bailiffs at work. The accuser: "So you call the representatives of the Soviet government, the All-Russian Central Executive Committee, thieves?" The Patriarch: "I am citing only church law." Then there is a discussion of the term blasphemy. While they were requisitioning the valuables from the Church of St. Basil the Great of Caesarea, the icon cover would not fit into a box, and at that point they trampled it with their feet. But the Patriarch himself had not been present. The accuser: "How do you know that? Give us the name of the priest who told you that, and we will arrest him immediately." The Patriarch does not give the name. That means it was a lie. The accuser presses on triumphantly. "No, who spread that repulsive slander?" The presiding judge: "Give us the names of those who trampled the icon cover. One can assume that after doing it they left their visiting cards. Otherwise the tribunal cannot believe you."
This book is continued on Cassette 3, Side 1. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1, Section 2, continued. Cassette 3, Side 1.
The presiding judge: "Give us the names of those who trampled the icon cover. One can assume that after doing it they left their visiting cards. Otherwise the tribunal cannot believe you." The Patriarch cannot name them. The presiding judge: "That means you have made an unsubstantiated assertion." It still remained to be proved that the Patriarch wanted to overthrow the Soviet government, and here is how it was proved. Propaganda is an attempt to prepare a mood preliminary to preparing a revolt in the future. The tribunal ordered criminal charges to be brought against the Patriarch. On May the 7th, sentence was pronounced. Of the 17 defendants, 11 were to be shot. They actually shot 5. As Krylenko said, "We didn't come here just to crack jokes." 1 week later, the Patriarch was removed from office and arrested. But this was not the very end. For the time being, he was taken to the Donskoy monastery and kept there in strict incarceration, so that the believers would grow accustomed to his absence. Remember how just a short while before, Krylenko had been astonished what danger could possibly threaten the Patriarch. Truly, when the danger really does come, there's no help for it, either in alarm bells or in telephone calls. 2 weeks after that, the Metropolitan Benjamin was arrested in Petrograd. He had not been a high official of the church before the revolution, nor had he even been appointed, like almost all metropolitans. In the spring of 1917, for the first time since the days of ancient Novgorod the Great, they had elected a metropolitan in Moscow and in Petrograd. A gentle, simple, easily accessible man, a frequent visitor in factories and mills, popular with the people and with the lower clergy, Benjamin had been elected by their votes. Not understanding the times, he had seen as his task the liberation of the church from politics, because it had suffered much from politics in the past. This was the metropolitan who was tried in the Petrograd church trial, June the 9th to July the 5th, 1922. The defendants, charged with resisting the requisition of church valuables, numbered several dozen in all, including a professor of theology and church law, archimandrites, priests, and laymen. Semyonov, the presiding judge of the tribunal, was 25 years old, and according to rumor had formerly been a baker. The chief accuser was a member of the Collegium of the People's Commissariat of Justice, P.A. Krasikov, a man of Lenin's age and a friend of Lenin when he was in exile in the Krasnoyarsk region, and later on in emigration as well. Vladimir Ilyich used to enjoy hearing him play the violin. Out on Nevsky Prospect and at the Nevsky turnoff, a dense crowd waited every day of the trial, and when the Metropolitan was driven past, many of them knelt down and sang, "Save, O Lord, thy people." It goes without saying that they arrested overzealous believers right on the street and in the court building also. Most of the spectators in the court were Red Army men, but even they rose every time the Metropolitan entered in his white ecclesiastical hood. Yet the accuser and the tribunal called him an enemy of the people. Let us note that this term already existed. From trial to trial, things closed in on the defense lawyers, and their humiliating predicament was already very apparent. Krylenko tells us nothing about this, but the gap is closed by an eyewitness. The tribunal roared out a threat to arrest Bobrishchev Pushkin himself, the principal defense lawyer, and this was already so in accord with the spirit of the times, and the threat was so real that Bobrishchev Pushkin made haste to hand over his gold watch and his billfold to lawyer Gurovich. And right then and there the tribunal actually ordered the imprisonment of a witness, Professor Yegorov, because of his testimony on behalf of the Metropolitan. As it turned out, Yegorov was quite prepared for this. He had a thick briefcase with him in which he had packed food, underwear, and even a small blanket. The reader can observe that the court was gradually assuming forms familiar to us. Metropolitan Benjamin was accused of entering, with evil intent, into an agreement with the Soviet government, no less, and thereby obtaining a relaxation of the decree on the requisition of valuables. It was charged that his appeal to Pomgol had been maliciously disseminated among the people. Samizdat, self-publication. And he had also acted in concert with the world bourgeoisie. Priest Krasnitsky, one of the principal living church schismatics and GPU collaborator, testified that the priests had conspired to provoke a revolt against the Soviet government on the grounds of famine. The only witnesses heard were those of the prosecution. Defense witnesses were not permitted to testify. Oh, how familiar it all is. More and more. Accuser Smirnov demanded 16 heads. Accuser Krasikov cried out, "The whole Orthodox Church is a subversive organization. Properly speaking, the entire Church ought to be put in prison." This was a very realistic program. Soon it was almost realized, and it was a good basis for a dialogue. Let us make use of a rather rare opportunity to cite several sentences that have been preserved from the speech of S.Y. Gurevich, who was the Metropolitan's defense attorney. "There are no proofs of guilt. There are no facts. There is not even an indictment. What will history say?" Oh, he certainly had discovered how to frighten them. History will forget and say nothing. "The requisition of church valuables in Petrograd took place in a complete calm, but here the Petrograd clergy is on the defendant's bench, and somebody's hands keep pushing them toward death. The basic principle which you stress is the good of the Soviet government, but do not forget that the Church will be nourished by the blood of martyrs." Not in the Soviet Union, though. "There is nothing more to be said, but it is hard to stop talking. While the debate lasts, the defendants are alive. When the debate comes to an end, life will end too." The tribunal condemned 10 of them to death. They waited more than a month for their execution, until the trial of the SRs had ended. It was as though they had processed them in order to shoot them at the same time as the SRs. And after that, VTSIK, the All-Russian Central Executive Committee, pardoned 6 of them. And 4 of them, the Metropolitan Benjamin, the Archimandrite Sergius, a former member of the State Duma, Professor of Law Y.P. Novitsky, and the barrister Kovsharov, were shot on the night of August the 12th to 13th. We insistently urge our readers not to forget the principle of provincial multiplicity. Where 2 church trials were held in Moscow and Petrograd, there were 22 in the provinces. They were in a big hurry to produce a criminal code in time for the trial of the SRs, the Socialist Revolutionaries. The time had come to set in place the granite foundation stones of the law. On May the 12th, as had been agreed, the session of VTSIK convened, but the projected code had not yet been completed. It had only just been delivered for analysis to Vladimir Ilyich Lenin at his Gorky estate outside Moscow. 6 articles of the code provided for execution by shooting as the maximum punishment. This was unsatisfactory. On May the 15th, on the margins of the draft code, Lenin added 6 more articles requiring execution by shooting, including, under Article 69, propaganda and agitation, particularly in the form of an appeal for passive resistance to the government and mass rejection of the obligations of military service or tax payments. In other words, like the Vyborg appeal, for which the Tsar's government had imposed sentences of 3 months' imprisonment. And one other crime that called for execution by shooting, unauthorized return from abroad. My, how the socialists all used to bob back and forth incessantly. And there was one punishment that was the equivalent of execution by shooting, exile abroad. Vladimir Ilyich foresaw a time not far distant when there would be a constant rush of people to the Soviet Union from Europe, and it would be impossible to get anyone voluntarily to leave the Soviet Union for the West. Lenin went on to express his principal conclusion to the People's Commissar of Justice. "Comrade Kursky, in my opinion we ought to extend the use of execution by shooting, allowing the substitution of exile abroad, to all activities of the Mensheviks, SRs, etc. We ought to find a formulation that would connect these activities with the international bourgeoisie." Lenin's italics. To extend the use of execution by shooting. Nothing left to the imagination there. And did they exile very many? Terror is a method of persuasion. This, too, could hardly be misunderstood. But Kursky, nonetheless, still didn't get the whole idea. In all probability, what he couldn't quite work out was a way of formulating that formulation, a way of working in that very matter of connection. The next day, he called on the chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, Lenin, for clarification. We have no way of knowing what took place during their conversation. But following it up on May the 17th, Lenin sent a second letter from Gorky. "Comrade Kursky, as a sequel to our conversation, I am sending you an outline of a supplementary paragraph for the criminal code. The basic concept, I hope, is clear, notwithstanding all the shortcomings of the rough draft. openly to set forth a statute which is both principled and politically truthful, and not just juridically narrow, to supply the motivation for the essence and the justification of terror, its necessity, its limits. The court must not exclude terror. It would be self-deception or deceit to promise this, and in order to provide it with a foundation and to legalize it in a principled way, clearly and without hypocrisy and without embellishment, it is necessary to formulate it as broadly as possible, for only revolutionary righteousness and a revolutionary conscience will provide the conditions for applying it more or less broadly in practice. With communist greetings, Lenin. We will not undertake to comment on this important document. What it calls for is silence and reflection. The document is especially important because it was one of Lenin's last directives on this earth. He had not yet fallen ill, and an important part of his political testament. 10 days after this letter, he suffered his first stroke, from which he recovered only incompletely and temporarily in the autumn months of 1922. Perhaps both letters to Kurski were written in that light and airy white marble boudoir study at the corner of the second floor, where the future deathbed of the leader already stood waiting. Attached to this letter is the rough draft mentioned in it, containing 2 versions of the supplementary paragraph, out of which would grow in a few years' time both Article 58.4 and all of our dear little old mother, Article 58. You read it, and you are carried away with admiration. That's what it really means, to formulate it as broadly as possible. That's what is meant by extending its use. You read, and you recollect how broad was the embrace of that dear little old mother. Propaganda or agitation, or participation in an organization, or assistance, objectively assisting or being capable of assisting, organizations or persons whose activity has the character... Hand me St. Augustine, and in a trice I can find room in that article for him too. Everything was inserted as required. It was retyped. Execution by shooting was extended, and the session of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee adopted the new criminal code shortly after May the 20th, and decreed it to be in effect from June the 1st, 1922 on. And so began, on the most legal basis, the 2-month-long J, trial of the SRs, June the 8th to August the 7th, 1922. The court was the supreme tribunal, the Vechtrib. The usual presiding judge, Comrade Karklin, a good name for a judge, derived from the word meaning to croak or caw, was replaced for this important trial, which was being watched closely by the entire socialist world, by the resourceful Georgy Pyatakov. Provident fate enjoys its little jokes, but it also leaves us time to think things over. It left Pyatakov 15 years. There were no defense lawyers. The defendants, all leading SRs, undertook their own defense. Pyatakov bore himself harshly and interfered with the defendants having their say. If my readers and I were not already sufficiently informed to know that what was important in every trial was not the charges brought, nor guilt, so-called, but expediency, we would perhaps not be prepared to accept this trial wholeheartedly. But expediency works without fail. The SRs, as opposed to the Mensheviks, were considered still dangerous, not yet dispersed and broken up, not yet finished off. And on behalf of the fortress of the newly created dictatorship, the proletariat, it was expedient to finish them off. Someone unfamiliar with this principle might mistakenly view the entire trial as an act of party vengeance. Involuntarily, one ponders the charges set forth in this trial, placing them in the perspective of the long, drawn-out, and still unfolding history of nations. With the exception of a very limited number of parliamentary democracies during a very limited number of decades, the history of nations is entirely a history of revolutions and seizures of power, and whoever succeeds in making a more successful and more enduring revolution is from that moment on graced with the bright robes of justice, and his every past and future step is legalized and memorialized in odes, whereas every past and future step of his unsuccessful enemies is criminal and subject to arraignment and a legal penalty. The criminal code had been adopted only 1 week earlier, but 5 whole years of post-revolutionary experience had been compressed into it. 20, 10, and 5 years earlier, the SRs had been the party next door in the effort to overthrow Tsarism, the party which had chiefly taken upon itself, thanks to the particular character of its terrorist tactics, the burden of hard labor imprisonment, which had scarcely touched the Bolsheviks. Now the first charge against them was that the SRs had initiated the civil war. Yes, they began it. They had begun it. They were accused of armed resistance to the October seizure of power. When the provisional government which they supported, and which was in part made up of their members, was lawfully swept out of office by the machine-gun fire of the sailors, the SRs tried altogether illegally to defend it, and even returned shot for shot, and even called into battle the military cadets of that deposed government. The fact that their efforts in defending it were very feeble, that they were beset by hesitations, and that they renounced it right away is another matter. For all that, their guilt was no less. Defeated in battle, they did not repent politically. They did not get down on their knees to the Council of People's Commissars, which had declared itself to be the government. They continued to insist stubbornly that the only legal government was the one which had been overthrown. They refused to admit right away that what had been their political line for 20 years was a failure, and they did not ask to be pardoned, nor to have their party dissolved and cease to be considered a party. And it had indeed been a failure, although this did not become clear immediately. In the same way, all the local Russian governments and those in outlying areas were illegal, those in Archangel, Samara, Ufa, or Omsk, the Ukraine, the Don, the Kuban, the Urals, or Transcaucasia, inasmuch as they all declared themselves to be governments after the Council of People's Commissars had declared itself to be the government. The second charge against them was that they had deepened the abyss of the civil war by taking part in demonstrations, by this token rebellions, on January the 5th and 6th, 1918, against the lawful authority of the workers' and peasants' government. They were supporting their illegal constituent assembly, elected by universal, free, equal, secret, and direct voting, against the sailors and the Red Guards, who legally dispersed both the assembly and the demonstrators. And what good could have come of peaceable sessions of the Constituent Assembly? Only the conflagration of a 3-year-long civil war, and that is why the civil war began, because not all the people submitted simultaneously and obediently to the lawful decrees of the Council of People's Commissars. The third charge was that they had not recognized the peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk, that lawful, life-saving peace of Brest-Litovsk, which had cut off not Russia's head, but only parts of its torso. By this token, declared the official indictment, there were present all the signs of high treason and criminal activity directed to drawing the country into war. High treason. That is another club with 2 ends. It all depends on which end you have hold of. From this followed the serious fourth charge. In the summer and fall of 1918, those final months and weeks when the Kaiser's Germany was scarcely managing to hold its own against the Allies, and the Soviet government, faithful to the Brest Treaty, was supporting Germany in its difficult struggle with trainloads of foodstuffs and a monthly tribute in gold, the SRs traitorously prepared, well, they didn't actually prepare anything, but, as was their custom, did more talking about it than anything. But what if they really had? To blow up the railroad tracks in front of one such train, thus keeping the gold in the motherland. In other words, they prepared criminal destruction of our public wealth, the railroads. At that time, the communists were not yet ashamed of and did not conceal the fact that, yes, indeed, Russian gold had been shipped off to Hitler's future empire, and it didn't seem to dawn on Krylenko despite his study in 2 academic departments, history and law, nor did any of his assistants whisper the notion to him that if steel rails are public wealth, then maybe gold ingots are, too. From this fourth charge, a fifth followed inexorably. The SRs had intended to procure the technical equipment for such an explosion with money received from Allied representatives. They had wanted to take money from the Entente in order not to give gold away to Kaiser Wilhelm. And this was the extreme of treason. Just in case, Krylenko did mutter something about the SRs also having connections with Ludendorff's general staff. But this stone had indeed landed in the wrong vegetable garden, and he quickly dropped the whole thing. From this it was only a very short step to the sixth charge, that the SRs had been Entente spies in 1918. Yesterday they had been revolutionaries, and today they were spies. At the time, this accusation probably sounded explosive, but since then, and after many, many trials, the whole thing makes one want to vomit. Well, then, the 7th and 10th points concerned collaboration with Savinkov, or Filonenko, or the cadets, or the Union of Rebirth. Had it really ever existed? And even with aristocratic, reactionary, dilettante, so-called white-lining students, or even the White Guards. This series of linked charges was well expounded by the prosecutor. The title of prosecutor had by now been restored to him. As a result of either hard thinking in his office or a sudden stroke of genius on the rostrum, he managed in this trial to come up with that tone of heartfelt sympathy and friendly criticism which he would make use of in subsequent trials with increasing self-assurance and in ever heavier doses, and which in 1937 would result in dazzling success. This tone created a common ground against the rest of the world between those doing the judging and those who were being judged, and it played on the defendant's particular soft spot. From the prosecutor's rostrum, they said to the SRs, "After all, you and we are revolutionaries." We, you and we, that adds up to us. And how could you have fallen so low as to join with the cadets? Yes, no doubt your heart is breaking. Or with the officers, or to teach the aristocratic, reactionary, dilettante students your brilliantly worked-out scheme of conspiratorial operation. None of the defendants' replies is available to us. Did any of them point out that the particular characteristic of the October coup had been to declare war immediately on all the other parties and forbid them to join forces? They're not hauling you in, so don't you dare peep. But for some reason one gets the feeling that some of the defendants sat there with downcast eyes, and that some of them truly had divided hearts. Just how could they have fallen so low? After all, for the prisoner who'd been brought in from a dark cell, the friendly, sympathetic attitude of the prosecutor in the big, bright hall struck home very effectively. And Krylenko discovered another very, very logical little path, which was to prove very useful to Vyshinsky when he applied it against Kamenev and Bukharin. On entering into an alliance with the bourgeoisie, you accepted money from them. At first you took it for the cause, only for the cause, and in no wise for party purposes. But where is the boundary line? Who can draw that dividing line? After all, isn't the cause a party cause also? And so you sank to the level, you, the Socialist Revolutionary Party, of being supported by the bourgeoisie. Where was your revolutionary pride? A full quota of charges, and then some, had been piled up, and the tribunal could have gone out to confer and thereupon nailed each of the prisoners with his well-merited execution. But alas, there was a big mix-up. A. Everything the Socialist Revolutionary Party had been accused of related to 1918. B. Since then, on February the 27th, 1919, an amnesty had been declared for SRs exclusively, which pardoned all their past belligerency against the Bolsheviks on the sole stipulation that they would not continue the struggle into the future. C. And they had not continued the struggle since that time. D. And it was now 1922. How could Krylenko get around that one? Some thought had been given to this point. When the Socialist International asked the Soviet government to drop charges and not put its socialist brothers on trial, some thought had been given to it. In fact, at the beginning of 1919, in the face of threats from Kolchak and Denikin, the SRs had renounced their task of revolt against the Bolsheviks and had abandoned all armed struggle against them. And to aid their communist brethren, the Samara SRs had even opened up a section of the Kolchak front, which was in fact why the amnesty had been granted. And right at the trial, the defendant Gendelman, a member of the Central Committee, said, "Give us the chance to make use of the whole gamut of so-called civil liberties, and we will not break the law." Give it to them. The whole gamut, to boot. What loud mouths! And it wasn't just that they weren't engaged in any opposition. They had recognized the Soviet government. In other words, they had renounced their former provisional government, yes, and the Constituent Assembly as well. And all they asked was a new election for the Soviets, with freedom for all parties to engage in electoral campaigning. Now, did you hear that? Did you hear that? That's where the hostile bourgeois beast poked his snout through. How could we? After all, this is a time of crisis. After all, we are encircled by the enemy. And in 20 years' time, and 50 years' time, and 100 years' time, for that matter, it will be exactly the same. And you want freedom for the parties to engage in electoral campaigning, you bastards? Politically sober people, said Krylenko, could only laugh in reply and shrug their shoulders. It had been a just decision, immediately and by all measures of state suppression, to prevent these groups from conducting propaganda against the government, and specifically in reply to the renunciation by the SRs of armed opposition and to their peaceful proposals, they had put the entire Central Committee of the Socialist Revolutionary Party in prison, as many of them as they could catch. That's how we do it. But to keep them in prison, and hadn't it already been 3 years, wasn't it necessary to try them? And what should they be charged with? This period had not been sufficiently investigated in the pre-trial examination, our prosecutor complained. But in the meanwhile, one charge was correct. In that same February 1919, the SRs had passed a resolution which they had not put into effect, though in terms of the new criminal code that didn't matter at all, to carry on secret agitation in the ranks of the Red Army in order to induce the soldiers to refuse to participate in reprisals against the peasants. And that was a low-down, foul betrayal of the revolution, to try to persuade men not to take part in reprisals. And they could also be charged with everything that the so-called foreign delegation of the Central Committee of the SRs, those prominent SRs who had fled to Europe, had said, written, and done. Mostly words. But all that wasn't enough. So here's what they thought up. Many defendants sitting here would not deserve to be indicted in the given case were it not for the charge of having planned terrorist acts. Allegedly, when the amnesty of 1919 had been published, none of the leaders of Soviet justice had imagined that the SRs had also planned to use terrorism against the leaders of the Soviet state. Well, indeed, who could possibly have imagined that? The SRs and terrorism all of a sudden? And if it had come to mind, it would have been necessary to include it in the amnesty too, or else not accept the gap in the Kolchak front. It was really very, very fortunate indeed that no one had thought of it, not until it was needed. Then someone thought of it. So, this charge had not been amnestied, for after all, struggle was the only offense that had been amnestied, and so Krylenko could now make the charge. And, in all likelihood, they had discovered so very much. In the first place, they had discovered what the SR leaders had said, and what hadn't those chatterboxes said in the course of a lifetime, back in the first days after the October seizure of Prague. Chernov, at the Fourth Congress of the SRs, had said that the party would counterpose all its forces against any attack on the rights of the people as it had under Tsarism. And everyone remembered how it had done that. Gotz had said, if the autocrats at Smolny also infringe on the Constituent Assembly, the Socialist Revolutionary Party will remember its old, tried and true tactics. Perhaps it did remember, but it didn't make up its mind to act. Yet apparently it could be tried for it anyway. In this area of our investigation, Krylenko complained because of conspiracy, there will be little testimony from witnesses. And he continued, this has made my task extremely difficult. In this area, that is terrorism, It is necessary at certain moments to wander about in the shadows. What made Krylenko's task difficult was the fact that the use of terrorism against the Soviet government was discussed at the meeting of the SR Central Committee in 1918 and rejected. And now, years later, it was necessary to prove that the SRs had been engaged in self-deception. The SRs had said at the time that they would not resort to terrorism until and unless the Bolsheviks began to execute socialists. Or in 1920, they had said that if the Bolsheviks were to threaten the lives of SR hostages, then the party would take up arms. It was evidently all right to shoot the other hostages. So the question then was, why did they qualify their renunciation of terrorism? Why wasn't it absolute? And how had they even dared to think about taking up arms? Why were there no statements equivalent to absolute renunciation? But, Comrade Krylenko, maybe terrorism was their second nature. The SR party carried out no terrorist acts whatsoever, and this was clear even from Krylenko's summing up of the charges. But the prosecution kept stretching such facts as these. One of the defendants had in mind a plan for blowing up the locomotive of a train carrying the Council of People's Commissars to Moscow. That meant the Central Committee of the SRs was guilty of terrorism, and the terrorist Ivanova had spent one night near the railroad station with one charge of explosives, which meant there had been an attempt to blow up Trotsky's train, and therefore the SR Central Committee was guilty of terrorism. And further, Donskoy, a member of the Central Committee, warned Fanya Kaplan that she would be expelled from the party if she fired at Lenin. But that wasn't enough. Why hadn't she been categorically forbidden to? Or perhaps, why hadn't she been denounced to the Cheka? It was feathers of this sort that Krylenko kept plucking from the dead rooster, that the SRs had not taken measures to stop individual terrorist acts by their unemployed and languishing gunmen. That was the whole of their terrorism. Yes, and those gunmen of theirs didn't do anything either. In 1922, two of them, Konopleva and Semyonov, with suspicious eagerness, enriched the GPU and the tribunal with their voluntary evidence. But their evidence couldn't be pinned on the SR Central Committee, and suddenly and inexplicably, these inveterate terrorists were released scot-free. All the evidence was such that it had to be bolstered up with props. Krylenko explained things this way in regard to one of the witnesses. If this person had really wanted to make things up, it is unlikely he would have done so in such a way as to hit the target merely by accident. Strongly put indeed. This could be said about any piece of fabricated testimony whatever. Or else, about Donskoy. Could one really suspect him of possessing the special insight to testify to what the prosecution wanted? It was just the other way around with Konopleva. The reliability of her testimony was evidenced by the fact that she had not testified to everything the prosecution needed, but enough for the defendants to be shot. If we ask whether Konopleva concocted all this, then it is clear. If one is going to concoct, one must really concoct. He should know. And if one is going to expose someone, one should really expose him. But she, you see, did not carry it through to the end. Then things are put still another way. After all, it is unlikely that Yefimov needed to put Konopleva in danger of execution without cause. Once more correct, once more strongly put. Or even more strongly. Could this encounter have taken place? Such a possibility is not excluded. Not excluded? That means it did take place. Off to the races. Then, too, the subversive group. They talked about this for a long time, and then suddenly, dissolved for lack of activity. So what was all the fuss about? There had been several expropriations of money from Soviet institutions. The SRs had nothing with which to work, to rent apartments, to move from city to city. But previously these had been the lovely, noble X's, as all the revolutionists called them. And now, in a Soviet court, they were robbery and concealment of stolen goods. Through the material adduced by the prosecution in this trial, the dull, unblinking yellow street lamps of the law throw light on the whole uncertain, wavering, deluded history of this pathetically garrulous, essentially lost, helpless, and even inactive party which never was worthily led. And its every decision or lack of decision, its every casting about, upsurge or retreat, was transformed into and regarded as total guilt. Guilt and more guilt. And if in September 1921, 10 months before the trial, the SR Central Committee, already sitting in the Butyrki, had written to the newly elected Central Committee that it did not agree to the overthrow of the Bolshevik dictatorship by any available means, but only through rallying the working masses and the dissemination of propaganda, all of which meant that even as they languished in prison, they did not agree to being liberated through either terrorism or conspiracy, then that, too, was converted into their primary guilt. Aha! So that means that you did agree to its overthrow. And what if they were, nevertheless, not guilty of overthrowing the government, and not guilty of terrorism, and if there had been hardly any expropriations at all, and if they had long since been forgiven for all the rest? Our favorite prosecutor pulled out his canonical weapon of last resort. Ultimately, failure to denounce is a category of crime applying to all the defendants without exception, and it must be considered as having been proved. The Socialist Revolutionary Party was guilty of not having squealed on itself. Now, there's something that couldn't miss. This represented a discovery that juridical thought had made in the new code. It was a paved highway, along which they would keep driving and driving grateful descendants into Siberia. And Krylenko burst out in a temper. Hardened, eternal enemies! That's who the defendants are. In that case, it's quite clear, even without any trial, what has to be done with them. The code was still so new that Krylenko could not even remember the main counter-revolutionary articles by their numbers, but how he slashed about with those numbers, how profoundly he cited and interpreted them, just as if the blade of the guillotine had for decades hinged and dropped only on those articles. And especially new and important was the fact that we did not draw the distinction between methods and means the old Tsarist code had drawn. Such distinctions had no influence either on the classification of the charges or on the penalties imposed. For us, intent and action were identical. A resolution had been passed, we would try them for that. And whether it was carried out or not had no essential significance. Whether a man whispered to his wife in bed that it would be a good thing to overthrow the Soviet government, or whether he engaged in propaganda during elections or threw a bomb, it was all one and the same, and the punishment was identical. And just as a foresighted painter proceeds from his first few brusquely drawn angular strokes to create the whole desired portrait, so for us, the entire panorama of 1937, 1945, and 1949 becomes ever clearer and more visible in the sketches of 1922. But no, one thing is missing. What's missing is the conduct of the defendants. They have not yet become trained sheep. They are still people. We have been told little, very little, but from that little we can understand a great deal. Sometimes, through carelessness, Krylenko cites what they said right at the trial. For example, the defendant Berg accused the Bolsheviks of responsibility for the deaths of January the 5th, shooting down those who were demonstrating on behalf of the Constituent Assembly. And what Liberov said was even more direct. I admit I was guilty of failing to work hard enough at overthrowing the Bolshevik government in 1918. Yevgenia Ratner adhered to the same line, and Berg also declared, I consider myself guilty before the workers' Russia for having been unable to fight with all my strength against the so-called workers' and peasants' government, but I hope that my time has not yet gone. It has gone, darling, all gone. Of course, there is in all this an element of the ancient passion for the resounding phrase, but there is firmness, too. The prosecutor argued, the accused are dangerous to Soviet Russia because they consider everything they did to have been a good thing. Perhaps certain of the defendants find their own consolation in the hope that some future chronicler will praise them or their conduct at the trial. And a decree of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee, issued after the trial, declared, at the trial itself they reserve to themselves the right to continue their former activity. The defendant, Gendelman Grabowski, a lawyer himself, was conspicuous during the trial for his arguments with Krylenko on tampering with the testimony of witnesses and on special methods of treating witnesses before the trial. In other words, the obvious working over they had gotten from the GPU. It is all there. All the elements are there. There was only a little way to go before attaining the ideal. Apparently, the preliminary interrogation had been conducted under the supervision of the prosecutor, that same Krylenko, and during that process, individual instances of a lack of consistency in testimony had been ironed out. Yet, some testimony was presented for the first time only at the trial itself. Well, so what? So there were some rough spots, so it wasn't perfect. But in the last analysis, we have to declare altogether clearly and coldly that we are not concerned with the question of how the court of history is going to view our present deed. And as far as the rough spots are concerned, we will take them under advisement and correct them. But as it was, Krylenko, squirming, had to bring up, probably for the first and last time in Soviet jurisprudence, the matter of the inquiry, the initial inquiry required before investigation. And here's how cleverly he handled this point. The proceeding which took place in the absence of the prosecutor and which you considered the investigation was actually the inquiry, and the proceeding in the presence of the prosecutor, which you regarded as the re-investigation when all the loose ends were gathered up and all the bolts tightened, was really the investigation. The disorganized materials provided by the organs for inquiry and unverified by the investigation have much less value as proof than the materials provided by the skillfully directed investigation. Clever, wasn't it? Just try grinding that up in your mortar. To be practical about it, Krylenko no doubt resented having to spend half a year getting ready for this trial, then another 2 months barking at the defendants, and then having to drag out his summation for 15 hours, when all these defendants had more than once been in the hands of the extraordinary organs at times when these organs had extraordinary powers, but thanks to some circumstances or other, they had succeeded in surviving. So now Krylenko had to slave away to try and get them executed legally. There was, of course, only one possible verdict, execution for every last one of them. But Krylenko qualifies this generously, because this case is being watched by the whole world. The prosecutor's demand does not constitute a directive to the court, which the latter would be obliged to accept immediately for consideration or decision. What a fine court, too, that requires such an explanation. And indeed the tribunal did demonstrate its daring in the sentences it imposed. It did not hand down the death penalty for every last one of them, but for 14 only. Most of the rest got prison and camp sentences, while sentences in the form of productive labor were imposed on another 100. And just remember, reader, remember, all the other courts of the Republic watch what the Supreme Tribunal does. It provides them with guidelines. The sentences of the Werktrib are used as directives for their guidance. As to how many more would now be railroaded in the provinces, you can figure that out for yourself.
This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1, Section 2, continued. Cassette 3, Side 2.
The sentences of the Werktrib are used as directives for their guidance. As to how many more would now be railroaded in the provinces, you can figure that out for yourself. And, probably, on appeal, the decision of the Presidium of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee was worth the whole trial. The death sentences were to remain in effect, but not to be carried out for the time being. The further fate of those condemned would depend, then, on the conduct of those SRs who had not yet been arrested, apparently including those abroad as well. In other words, if you move against us, we'll squash them. In the fields of Russia, they were reaping the second peacetime harvest. There was no shooting except in the courtyards of the Cheka, Perkurov in Yaroslavl, Metropolitan Vanyamin in Petrograd, and always, always, always. Beneath the azure sky, our first diplomats and journalists sailed abroad across the blue waters, and the Central Executive Committee of Workers' and Peasants' Deputies thrust into its pockets eternal hostages. The members of the ruling party read all 60 issues of Pravda devoted to the trial, for they all read the papers, and all of them said, "Yes, yes, yes." No one mumbled, "No." What, then, were they surprised at in 1937? What was there to complain about? Hadn't all the foundations of lawlessness been laid, first by the extrajudicial reprisals of the Cheka, and then by these early trials and this young code? Wasn't 1937 also expedient? Expedient for Stalin's purposes, and perhaps history's too, for that matter. Prophetically, Krylenko let it slip that they were judging not the past, but the future. Only the first swath cut by the scythe is difficult. On or about August the 20th, 1924, Boris Viktorovich Savinkov crossed the Soviet border. He was immediately arrested and taken to the Lubyanka. Many hypotheses were advanced about his return. Only a little while ago, a certain Ardamatsky, a person obviously connected with the archives and personnel of the Committee for State Security, published a story which, despite being adorned with pretentiously inflated literary gewgaws, is evidently close to the truth. The magazine Neva, number 11, 1967. Having induced certain of Savinkov's agents to betray him, and having deceived others, the GPU used them to set a foolproof trap, convincing Savinkov that inside Russia a large underground organization was languishing for lack of a worthy leader. It would have been impossible to devise a more effective trap. And it would have been impossible for Savinkov, after such a confused and sensational life, merely to spin it out quietly to the end in Nice. He couldn't bear not trying to pull off one more feat, and not returning to Russia and his death. In all, the interrogation lasted for just one session, which consisted solely of voluntary testimony and an evaluation of his activity. The official indictment was ready by August the 23rd. The speed was totally unbelievable, but it had impact. Someone had estimated the situation quite accurately. To have forced false and pitiful testimony out of Savinkov by torture would only have wrecked the authenticity of the picture. In the official indictment, couched in already well-developed terminology that turned everything upside down, Savinkov was charged with just about everything imaginable. With being a consistent enemy of the poorest peasantry, with assisting the Russian bourgeoisie in carrying out its imperialist ambitions, in other words, he was in favor of continuing the war with Germany, with maintaining relations with representatives of the Allied command, this would have been when he was in charge of the Ministry of War, with becoming a member of soldiers' committees for purposes of provocation, that is, he was elected by the soldiers' committees, and, last but not least, something to make even the chickens cackle with laughter, with having had monarchist sympathies. But all that was old hat. There were some new items, too, the standard charges for all future trials, money from the imperialists, espionage for Poland. They left out Japan, believe it or not. Yes, and he had also wanted to poison the Red Army with potassium cyanide, but for some reason he did not poison even one Red Army soldier. On August the 26th, the trial began. The presiding judge was Ulrich, this being our earliest encounter with him, and there was no prosecutor at all, nor any defense lawyer. Savinkov was lackadaisical in defending himself, and he raised hardly an objection at all to the evidence. He conceived of this trial in a lyrical sense. It was his last encounter with Russia, and his last opportunity to explain himself in public, and to repent, not of these imputed sins, but of others. And that theme song fitted well here and greatly confused the defendant. After all, we are all Russians together. You and we add up to us. You love Russia beyond a doubt, and we respect your love. And do we not love Russia too? In fact, are we not at present the fortress and the glory of Russia? And you wanted to fight against us? Repent. But it was the sentence that was most wonderful. Imposition of the death penalty is not required in the interests of preserving revolutionary law and order, and on the grounds that motives of vengeance should not influence the sense of justice of the proletarian masses, the death penalty was commuted to 10 years' imprisonment. Now that was a sensation, and it confused many minds, too. Did it mean a relaxation, a transformation? Ulrich even published in Pravda an apologetic explanation of why Savinkov had not been executed. You see how strong the Soviet government has become in only 7 years. Why should it be afraid of some Savinkov or other? On the 20th anniversary of the revolution, it is going to get weaker, and don't be too hard on us because we are going to execute thousands. And so, on the heels of the first riddle of his return, there would have been the second riddle of his being spared capital punishment, had it not been overshadowed in May 1925 by a third riddle. In a state of depression, Savinkov jumped from an unbarred window into the interior courtyard of the Lubyanka, and the Gai-Payushniki, his guardian angels, simply couldn't manage to stop him and hold on to his big, heavy body. However, just in case, so that there wouldn't be any scandal in the service, Savinkov left them a suicide letter in which he explained logically and coherently why he was killing himself, and this letter was so authentically phrased, so clearly written in Savinkov's style and vocabulary, that even Lev Borisovich, the son of the deceased, was fully convinced of its genuineness and explained to everyone in Paris that no one except his father could have written it, and that he had ended his life because he realized his political bankruptcy. And we, silly prisoners of a later Lubyanka, confidently parroted to one another that the steel nets hanging in the Lubyanka stairwells had been installed after Savinkov had committed suicide there. Thus do we succumb to fancy legends to the extent of forgetting that the experience of jailers is, after all, international in character. Such nets existed in American prisons as long ago as the beginning of the century, and how could Soviet technology have been allowed to lag behind? In 1937, when he was dying in a camp in the Kolyma, the former Chekist Artur Prayubel told one of his fellow prisoners that he had been one of the 4 who threw Savinkov from a 5th-floor window into the Lubyanka courtyard, and there is no conflict between that statement and Adamatsky's recent account. There was a low sill. It was more like a door to the balcony than a window. They had picked the right room. Only, according to Adamatsky, the guards were careless. According to Prayubel, they rushed him altogether. Thus, the second riddle, the unusually lenient sentence, was unravelled by the crude third riddle. The story ascribed to Prayubel could not be checked, but I had heard it, and in 1967 I told it to M.P. Yakubovich. He, with his still youthful enthusiasm and shining eyes, exclaimed, "I believe it! Things fit! And I didn't believe Blyumkin. I thought he was just bragging." What he had learned was this. At the end of the 20s, Blyumkin had told Yakubovich, after swearing him to secrecy, that he was the one who had written Savinkov's so-called suicide note on orders from the GPU. Apparently Blyumkin was allowed to see Savinkov in his cell constantly while he was in prison. He kept him amused in the evenings. Did Savinkov sense that death was creeping up on him? Sly, friendly death, which gives you no chance to guess the form your end will take? And this had helped Blyumkin acquire Savinkov's manner of speech and thought, had enabled him to enter into the framework of his last ideas. And they asked, why throw him out the window? Wouldn't it have been easier simply to poison him? Perhaps they showed someone the remains, or thought they might need to. And where, if not here, is the right place to report the fate of Blyumkin, who, for all his Chekist omnipotence, was fearlessly brought up short by Mandelstam? Ehrenberg began to tell Blyumkin's story, and suddenly became ashamed, and dropped the subject. And there is a story to tell, too. After the 1918 rout of the left SRs, Blyumkin, the assassin of the German ambassador Mirbach, not only went unpunished, was not only spared the fate of all the other left SRs, but was protected by Dzerzhinsky, just as Dzerzhinsky had wanted to protect Kozyrev. Superficially converted to Bolshevism, and was kept on, one gathers, for particularly important assassinations. At one point, close to the 30s, he was secretly sent to Paris to kill Bazhenov, a member of the staff of Stalin's secretariat who had defected, and one night he succeeded in throwing him off a train. However, his gambler's blood, or perhaps his admiration of Trotsky, led Blyomkin to the Prince's Islands in Turkey, where Trotsky was living. He asked Trotsky whether there were any assignments he could carry out for him in the Soviet Union, and Trotsky gave him a package for Radek. Blyomkin delivered it, and his visit to Trotsky would have remained a secret had not the brilliant Radek already been a stool pigeon. Radek brought down Blyomkin, who was thereupon devoured by the maw of the monster his own hands had suckled with its first bloody milk. And all the major and most famous trials are still ahead of us. Chapter 10. The law matures. But where were those mobs insanely storming the barbed wire barricades on our western borders whom we were going to shoot under Article 71 of the Criminal Code for unauthorized return to the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic? Contrary to scientific prediction, there were no such crowds, and that article of the code dictated by Lenin to Kurski remained useless. The only Russian crazy enough to do it was Savinkov, and they had ducked applying that article even to him. On the other hand, the opposite penalty, exile abroad instead of execution, was tried out immediately on a large scale. In those days, when he was composing the Criminal Code, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, developing his brilliant idea, wrote in the heat of the moment on May the 19th, "Comrade Dzerzhinsky, on the question of exiling abroad writers and professors who aid the counter-revolution, this is a measure which must be prepared most carefully. Unless we prepare well, we can commit stupidities. We must arrange the business in such a way as to catch these military spies, and keep on catching them constantly and systematically, and exiling them abroad. I beg you to show this secretly, and without making any copies of it, to members of the Politburo." The extreme secrecy was natural in view of the importance and instructive impact of the measure. The crystal-clear line-up of forces on the class front in Soviet Russia was, to put it simply, spoiled by the presence of this shapeless, jelly-like stain of the old bourgeois intelligentsia, which, in the ideological area, genuinely played the role of military spies, and the very best solution one could imagine was to scrape off that stagnant scum of ideas and toss it out abroad. Comrade Lenin had already been stricken by his illness, but the members of the Politburo had apparently given their approval, and Comrade Dzerzhinsky had done the catching. At the end of 1922, about 300 prominent Russian humanists were loaded onto a barge, perhaps? No, they were put on a steamer and sent off to the European garbage dump. Among those who settled down in exile and acquired reputations were the philosophers N.O. Losky, S.N. Bulgakov, N.A. Berdyaev, F.A. Stepun, B.P. Vysheslavstev, L.P. Karsavin, S.L. Frank, I.A. Ilyin. The historians S.P. Melgunov, V.A. Mayakotin, A.A. Kidzaveta, I.I. Lapshin, and others. The writers and publicists Y.I. Eichenfeld, A.S. Idzgoyev, M.A. Osorgin, A.V. Pershekonov. At the beginning of 1923, additional small groups were sent off, including, for example, V.F. Bulgakov, the secretary of Lev Tolstoy. And because of questionable associations, some mathematicians also shared this fate, including D.F. Silivanov. However, it didn't work out constantly and systematically. Perhaps the roar with which the émigrés announced that they regarded it as a gift made it apparent that this punishment left something to be desired, that it was a mistake to have let go good material for the executioner, and that poisonous flowers might grow on that garbage dump. And so they abandoned this form of punishment, and all subsequent purging led to either the executioner or the archipelago. The improved criminal code, promulgated in 1926, which in effect continued right into Khrushchev's times, tied all the formally scattered political articles into one durable dragnet, Article 58, and the roundup was underway. The catch swiftly expanded to include the engineering and technical intelligentsia. It was especially dangerous because it occupied a firm position in the economy, and it was hard to keep an eye on it with the help of the progressive doctrine alone. It now became clear that the trial in defense of Oldenburger had been a mistake. After all, a very nice little centre had been organized there, and Krylenko's declaration that there was no question of sabotage on the part of the engineers in 1920 and 1921 had granted an all-too-hasty absolution. Now it was not sabotage, but worse, wrecking, a word discovered, it appears, by a rank-and-file interrogator in the Shakhty case. It had no sooner been established that wrecking was what had to be tracked down, notwithstanding the non-existence of this concept in the entire history of mankind, than they began to discover it without any trouble in all branches of industry and in all individual enterprises. However, there was no unity of plan, no perfection of execution in all these hit-or-miss discoveries, although Stalin, by virtue of his character, and of course the entire investigative branch of our judicial apparatus, evidently aspired to just that. But our law had finally matured, and could show the world something really perfect, a big, coordinated, well-organized trial, this time a trial of engineers. And that is how the Shakhty case came about. K. The Shakhty case. May the 18th to July the 15th, 1928. This case was tried before a special assize of the Supreme Court of the USSR under presiding Judge A.Y. Vyshinsky, who was still the rector of First Moscow University. The chief accuser was N.V. Krylenko. What a significant encounter, rather like a handing over of the juridical relay baton. And the members of the tribunal were the old revolutionaries Vasilyev Yuzhin and Antonov Saratovsky. The very simple folk sound of their family names inclines one to a favorable reaction. They are easy to remember, and when suddenly in 1962 obituaries of certain victims of repression appeared in his vestiaire, whose signature was at the bottom? That of the long-lived Antonov Saratovsky. There were 53 defendants and 56 witnesses. How spectacular! Alas, in its spectacular aspect lay the weakness of this case. If one were to tie to each of the defendants only 3 threads of evidence, there would still have to be 159 of them. And meanwhile, Krylenko had only 10 fingers and Vyshinsky another 10. Of course, the defendants strove to expose their heinous crimes to society, but not all of them did, only 16. 13 wiggled back and forth, and 24 didn't admit their guilt at all. This introduced an impermissible discord, and the masses could certainly not understand it. Along with its positive aspects, which had incidentally already been displayed in earlier trials, such as the helplessness of the defendants and of the defense attorneys, and their inability either to budge or to deflect the implacable boulder of the sentence, the shortcomings of the new trial were fully apparent. Someone less experienced than Krylenko might have forgiven them, but not he. On the threshold of the classless society, we were at last capable of realizing the conflictless trial, a reflection of the absence of inner conflict in our social structure, in which not only the judge and the prosecutor, but also the defense lawyers and the defendants themselves would strive collectively to achieve their common purpose. Anyway, the whole scale of the Shakhty case, comprising as it did the coal industry alone and the Donetsk basin alone, was disproportionately paltry for this era. It appears that then and there, on the day the Shakhty case ended, Krylenko began to dig a new, capacious pit. Even 2 of his own colleagues in the Shakhty case, the public accusers Osadichi and Shine, fell into it. And it goes without saying that the entire apparatus of the Ogpu, which had already landed in Yagoda's firm hands, aided him willingly and adroitly. It was necessary to create and uncover an engineers' organization which encompassed the entire country, and for this purpose it was essential to have several strong, prominent wreckers at its head. And what engineer was unaware of just such an unequivocally strong and impatiently proud leader, Pyotr Akimovich Parchinsky? An important mining engineer from as far back as the beginning of the century, he had been the deputy chairman of the War Industry Committee during World War I. In other words, he had directed the war efforts of all Russian industry, which had managed, during the course of the war, to make up for the failures in Tsarist preparations. After February 1917, he became the Deputy Minister of Trade and Industry. He had been persecuted under the Tsar for revolutionary activity. he had been imprisoned 3 times after October, in 1917, 1918, and 1922. From 1920 on, he had been a professor at the Mining Institute and a consultant to the Gosplan, the State Planning Commission. For more details about him, see Part 3, Chapter 10. They picked this Palchinsky to be the chief defendant in a grandiose new trial. However, the thoughtless Krylenko, stepping into what was for him a new field, engineering, not only knew nothing about the resistance of materials, but could not even conceive of the potential resistance of souls, despite 10 years of already sensational activity as a prosecutor. Krylenko's choice turned out to be a mistake. Palchinsky resisted every pressure the Ogpu knew and did not surrender. In fact, he died without signing any sort of nonsense at all. N.K. von Meck and A.F. Velichko were subjected to torture with him, and they, too, appear not to have given in. We do not yet know whether they died while under torture or whether they were shot, but they proved it was possible to resist and that it was possible not to give in, and thus they left behind a spotlight of reproach to shine on all the famous subsequent defendants. To cover up his defeat, on May the 24th, 1929, Yagoda published a brief GPU communique on the execution of the 3 for large-scale wrecking, which also announced the condemnation of many other unidentified persons. But how much time had been spent for nothing, nearly a whole year, and how many nights of interrogation, and how much inventiveness on the part of the interrogators, and all to no avail. And Krylenko had to start over from the very beginning and find a leader who was both brilliant and strong, and at the same time utterly weak and totally pliable. But so little did he understand this cursed breed of engineers that another whole year was spent in unsuccessful tries. From the summer of 1929 on, he worked over Khrennikov, but Khrennikov, too, died without agreeing to play a dastardly role. They twisted old Fedotov, but he was too old, and furthermore he was a textile engineer, which was an unprofitable field. And 1 more year was wasted. The country was waiting for the all-inclusive wreckers' trial, and Comrade Stalin was waiting, but things just couldn't seem to fall into place for Krylenko. And it is quite possible that this failure of his was held against him by the leader and led to the symbolic destruction of the prosecutor on the very same guillotine as his victims. It was only in the summer of 1930 that someone found or suggested Ramzin, the director of the Thermal Engineering Institute. He was arrested, and in 3 months a magnificent drama was prepared and performed, the genuine perfection of our justice and an unattainable model for world justice. L. The Promparty, Industrial Party, Trial. November the 25th to December the 7th, 1930. This case was tried at a special assize of the Supreme Court with the same Vyshinsky, the same Antonov-Salatovsky, and that same favorite of ours, Krylenko. This time, none of those technical reasons arose to prevent the readers being offered a full stenographic report of the trial, or to prohibit the attendance of foreign correspondents. There was a majesty of concept. All the nation's industry, all its branches and planning organs, sat on the defendants' benches. However, only the eyes of the man who arranged it all could see the crevices into which the mining industry and railroad transportation had disappeared. At the same time, there was a thrift in the use of material. There were only 8 defendants in all. The mistakes of the Shakhty trial had been taken into account. You are going to exclaim, can 8 men represent the entire industry of the country? Yes, indeed, we have more even than we need. 3 out of 8 are solely in textiles, representing the industrial branch most important for national defense. But there were, no doubt, crowds of witnesses. Just 7 in all, who were exactly the same sort of wreckers as the defendants, and were also prisoners. But there were no doubt bales of documents that exposed them, drawings, projects, directives, summaries of results, proposals, dispatches, private correspondence. No, not one. You mean to say not even one tiny piece of paper? How could the GPU let that sort of thing get by? They had arrested all those people, and they hadn't even grabbed one little piece of paper. There had been a lot, but it had all been destroyed, because there was no place to keep the files. At the trial, they produced only a few newspaper articles published in the émigré press and our own. But in that event, how could the prosecution present its case? Well, to be sure, there was Nikolai Vasilievich Krylenko, and to be sure it wasn't the first time either. The best evidence, no matter what the circumstances, is the confessions of the defendants. But what confessions? These confessions were not forced, but inspired. Repentance tearing whole monologues from the breast, and talk, and more talk, and self-exposure and self-flagellation. They told old man Fedotov, who was 66, that he could sit down, that he had talked long enough, but no, he kept pouring out additional explanations and interpretations. For 5 sessions in a row, no questions were asked. The defendants kept talking and explaining, and kept asking for the floor again in order to supply whatever they had left out. They presented inferentially everything the prosecution needed without any questions whatever being asked. Ramzin, after extensive explanations, went on to provide brief resumes for the sake of clarity, as if he were addressing slow-witted students. The defendants were afraid most of all that something might be left unexplained, that someone might go unexposed, that someone's name might go unmentioned, that someone's intention to wreck might not have been made clear. And how they reviled themselves. I am a class enemy. I was bribed. Our bourgeois ideology. And then the prosecutor. Was that your error? And Chernovsky replied, and crime. There was simply nothing for Krylenko to do. For 5 sessions he went on drinking tea and eating cookies, or whatever else they brought him. But how did the defendants sustain such an emotional explosion? There was no tape recorder to take down their words, but Otsep, the defense attorney, described them. The defendant's words flowed in a businesslike manner, cold and professionally calm. There you are, such a passion for confession, and businesslike at the same time. Cold? More than that, they appear to have mumbled their glib repentance so listlessly that Vyshinsky often asked them to speak louder, more clearly, because they couldn't be heard. The harmony of the trial was not at all disturbed by the defense, which agreed with all the prosecutor's proposals. The principal defense lawyer called the prosecutor's summation historic, and described his own as narrow, admitting that in making it he had gone against the dictates of his heart, for a Soviet defense lawyer is first of all a Soviet citizen, and, like all workers, he too is outraged at the crimes of the defendants. During the trial, the defense asked shy and tentative questions and then instantly backed away from them if Vyshinsky interrupted. The lawyers actually defended only 2 harmless textile officials and did not challenge the formal charges nor the description of the defendants' actions, but asked only whether the defendants might avoid execution. Is it more useful, comrade judges, to have their corpses or their labor? How foul-smelling were the crimes of these bourgeois engineers. Here is what they consisted of. They planned to reduce the tempo of development, as, for instance, to an overall annual increase in production of only 20 to 22%, whereas the workers were prepared to increase it by 40 to 50%. They slowed down the rate of mining local fuels. They were too slow in developing the Kuznetsk Basin. They exploited theoretical and economic arguments, such as whether to supply the Donetsk Basin with electricity from the Dnieper power station, or whether to build a super-trunk line between Moscow and the Donbass, in order to delay the solutions of important problems. The work stops while engineers argue. They postponed considering new engineering projects, that is, they did not authorize them immediately. In lectures on the resistance of materials, they took an anti-Soviet line. They installed worn-out equipment. They tied up capital funds, for example, by using them for costly and lengthy construction projects. They carried out unnecessary repairs. They misused metals. Some grades of iron were wanting. They created an imbalance between the departments of a plant and between the supply of raw materials and the capacity for processing them industrially. This was particularly notable in the textile industry, where they built 1 or 2 factories more than they needed to process the cotton harvest. Then they leapt from minimal to maximal plans, and obvious wrecking began through the accelerated development of that same unfortunate textile industry. Most importantly, they planned sabotage in the field of electric power. even though none was ever carried out. Thus, wrecking did not take the form of actual damage done, but remained within the area of operational planning. Yet it was intended to lead to a nationwide crisis and even to economic paralysis in 1930. But it didn't, and only because of the competitive industrial and financial plans of the masses, doubling the figures. Yeah, begins the skeptical reader. What? That isn't enough for you? But if, at the trial, we repeat every point and chew it over 5 or 8 times, then perhaps it turns out not to be so negligible. Yeah. The reader of the 60s nonetheless sticks to his own view. Mightn't all that have happened precisely because of those competing industrial and financial plans? Aren't things bound to be out of balance if any union meeting, without consulting Gosplan,